You were somewhere along the Oxford Canal on a warm evening in July of 1890, and the hour has slipped past sunset into a long amber dusk that seems reluctant to end. The air is so still that you might forget it is there at all, except for the soft weight of it against your skin, carrying the mingled scent of cut hay from a distant field and the cooler, greener smell of water mint growing in the shallows. Above you, the sky that was pale blue only an hour ago has turned layer by layer into a wash of apricot and dusty rose, with a single band of lemon light clinging to the horizon behind a row of elm trees on the far side of the canal. The silhouette of those trees is perfectly still, not a leaf stirring, and they stand like dark cutouts pasted against the fading glow, their shapes beginning to merge with the coming night. The Oxford Canal here runs between low, rolling fields somewhere south of Napton and north of Banbury, following a contour so gentle that the water seems almost unaware of its own flow. In truth, the canal does not flow at all in any hurry. It is a long, placid ribbon of water that moves only when the locks coax it downhill, and between the locks it rests in long pounds where the current is so faint you could float a feather on the surface and watch it barely drift for an hour. Right now, at the tail end of this July day, the surface is more than still. It is a perfect mirror, unbroken by any breeze, reflecting the darkening hedgerow, the tall meadow grasses, and the first few bats that have begun to flicker against the violet sky like tiny black cinders. Looking into the water, you see a second world hanging upside down, a world of soft cloud streaks and deepening color, as complete and motionless as the one you are sitting in. You may be on the grassy bank beside the towpath, your back against a weathered wooden post that was once part of a fence, or perhaps you are simply there, an unhurried presence in the landscape, taking in the way the light catches the long reeds in the surface of the canal with a sheen like polished pewter. The towpath at your side is a narrow track of packed earth and gravel, dry now after days of summer sun, with the occasional tuft of plantain or dandelion pushing up where the hooves of horses do not fall. Across the water, on the offside bank, a thick hedge of hawthorn and bramble forms a dense, dark wall that will soon lose all its detail to the darkness, and from somewhere deep inside that hedge, a wood pigeon coos its five-note call, a sound so drowsy and repetitive that it seems to belong to the fabric of the evening rather than to any living bird. In the midst of this quiet landscape sits the loch, the reason you have come here if indeed you had a reason, although the loch does not demand your attention any more than the soft dusk does. It is a narrow chamber built of honey-coloured local stone, the blocks cut and laid long ago so carefully that the joints between them are nearly invisible, covered in places by a thin skin of green algae and cushiony moss. The loch is flanked by two pairs of heavy oak gates, the top gates pointing uphill towards the higher pound, the bottom gates pointing downhill towards the lower reach, and both sets are closed now, the mitre edges pressed together in a watertight seal that is so perfect not a single trickle escapes. Because the loch is empty and waiting for the next boat, the water level inside the chamber is low, matching the level of the lower pound so that the stone walls rise up beside you with a shadowed, damp smell, and the lower gates are wet to about the height of a man's knee, while the top gates stand high and dry, their wood pale grey from sun and weather. The balance beams of the gates stretch out over the loch chamber like long wooden arms, oak timbers so thick they would take two hands to encircle, their surfaces polished to a dark shine where countless palms have pushed them open and closed over the decades. Iron strap hinges, painted black, but now peppered with rust spots, fasten the gates to the stone quoins, and at the end of each balance beam a simple iron handle dangles on a chain, catching the last light with a dull gleam. On top of the top gates a walkway plank, grooved by boot nails, spans from one side of the loch to the other, allowing the lockkeeper to cross without descending into the empty chamber below, though just now there is no one there, and the plank is nothing but a dark line against the fading sky. The paddle gear, the machinery that controls the filling and emptying of the loch, stands at intervals along the stone coping, black iron frames with toothed ratchets and spindles that wait to be turned by the lockkeeper's windlass. At the moment, every paddle is fully down, the ground paddles buried below the stonework, the gate paddles nested inside the balance beams, and the whole mechanism is silent, the iron cold to the touch, even in the summer air. A single windlass, the heavy L-shaped crank the lockkeeper uses, hangs from a hook driven into the mortar beside the nearest ground paddle. Its shaft worn smooth from years of handling and glinting faintly where the paint has been rubbed away. Just beyond the top gate, on the same side as the towpath, a lockkeeper's cottage nestles into the cutting, built of the same honeystone, with a steep slate roof that slopes down almost to the ground at the back. One small window, its panes divided into 4 squares by wooden mullions, shows a glow pale and warm. Though no lamp has yet been lit inside, it is only the reflection of the last light on the glass, and behind it the shape of a chair and a table are barely visible. A thin wisp of smoke rises from the chimney, straight as a column because there is no wind to bend it, smelling faintly of coal and drawing a soft grey line across the sky before dissolving into the indigo of the east. The cottage door, painted a deep green and half open, reveals nothing but a cool shadow, and a pair of worn boots stand on the stone doorstep, waiting for their owner. Down at the water's edge, at the foot of the lock, the lower pound stretches away into the gathering dusk until it rounds a bend and disappears between thick banks of alder. The water here is almost black already, though the sky still holds some light, and the reflections have become long smears of silver and charcoal that tremble only when a water insect skates across the surface on fine legs, sending out tiny ripples that widen and vanish without sound. A few yards from the bottom gates, a wooden footbridge, its planks grey and splintered, crosses the canal in a single low arch, and beneath it the dark water seems to grow thicker, as if the night began in that shadow and is slowly spreading outward in all directions. Now the sounds of the evening begin to layer themselves over the silence, each one distinct but all merging into a single peaceful hum. A robin sings its thin silvery song from the top of a hawthorn bush, its notes falling like drops of water, and then as the light dips further, the robin stops and the bats take over the air with their rapid, silent wing beats that you do not hear so much as feel as a faint stir against your cheek. Far off, somewhere behind the cottage, a dog barks once and then does not bark again, the echo muffled by the hedgerows. The wood pigeon coos its last call of the day and settles deep into the branches to sleep, and in the quiet that follows, you can hear the sound of your own breathing, if you listen for it, slow and even, as if your body has already begun to match the rhythm of the dusk. The stone of the lock still holds a breath of the sun's warmth, and if you were to stretch out your hand and touch the coping, you would find it faintly warm against your palm, the algae giving way slightly under your fingertips like velvet. The lock chamber itself is cool in contrast, its depth holding the chill of the water and the earth, and the smell that rises from it is a mixture of whetstone, mud, and the clean metallic scent of water that has passed through miles of countryside. A single feather, white and small, rests on the water's surface just inside the lock, floating perfectly still, and from time to time a tiny bubble rises from the culvert opening and pops with a sound so small it is barely there, a quiet plink that seems to count out seconds nobody is measuring. As you sit or stand or simply exist in that quiet spot, the color of the sky continues its slow transformation, the warm tones withdrawing to the west and leaving the east a deep velvety blue in which the first stars, pale and tentative, are beginning to prick through. The evening star hangs above the elm trees like a peephole into something brighter beyond, and its reflection in the still water is a single point of light that does not waver. The temperature drops slightly, just enough for a coolness to rise from the grass and brush your ankles, and the scent of the canal changes with it, growing earthier, with a hint of wet iron from the lock gear and the distant perfume of night-scented stock from a cottage garden you cannot see. There is no hurry here, no clock ticking, no expectation that anything will happen or that you should move. The lock sits empty and patient, the top gates and bottom gates closed equally against the 2 levels of water, the paddles all down, the windlass hanging ready on its hook, the cottage smoke still climbing in a straight line. The narrowboat that will arrive has not even appeared around the far bend yet, and may not for another hour. So the scene holds in suspension, a tableau of a summer dusk along the Oxford Canal in 1890, a moment stretched out as long and calm as the water itself. The chirrup of a grasshopper starts up in the long grass a few feet away, its stridulation a rhythmic hissing that rises and falls like the breathing of the land, and then it too stops, leaving only the deep layered silence that is not empty but full of the memory of sound. The reflections in the canal deepen still further, the sky above now a mirror image of the sky below, so that the stone lock, the heavy gates, and the darkening hedges seem to float between two worlds, suspended in a quiet so complete that even your thoughts become soft and formless, drifting like the midges that hover in clouds just above the water without any urgency at all. And the lock waits, as it has waited every summer evening for nearly 100 years, for the soft clop of a horse and the slow approach of a narrowboat through the fading light. The lockkeeper's name was Thomas, though nobody had called him by it in so long that even he sometimes forgot to answer to the sound. The boatmen and the carriers who worked the Oxford Canal between the coalfields and the towns called him Old Tom or simply Lockie, and he answered to either with the same slow nod he gave to everything, a nod that seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than politeness. As if his body had learned over the decades to move at the same unhurried pace as the water he tended. He was a man of perhaps 65 years, with a frame that had once been sturdy and was now lean and knotted, his shoulders slightly rounded from leaning into countless balance beams, and his hands darkened by sun, water, and the iron of 1,000 windlass turns. The skin of those hands was like the leather of an old harness, cross-hatched with fine lines and marked here and there by small white scars from slipped tools and frayed ropes, the knuckles slightly swollen from a lifetime of gripping and winding and pushing. Inside the cottage, Thomas sat at a wooden table that had been scrubbed so many times the grain stood up in ridges, and before him a heavy earthenware mug held the last inch of tea, long gone cold. The tea was weak because he had used the leaves 3 times already, and the liquid was a pale amber that looked like the color of the canal water after heavy rain, though it tasted of nothing much except warmth and habit. The cottage around him was a single room downstairs with a sleeping loft above, reached by a steep ladder, and every surface in it spoke of solitary, orderly living. A black iron range, its fire banked with slack so that only a faint red glow showed through the grate bars, kept the room at a steady, drowsy temperature. On the mantelpiece above it, a tin clock ticked with a sound so regular it had become part of the silence, and beside the clock stood a small framed photograph of a woman whose features had faded to pale shadows. A photograph he no longer looked at directly, but would have missed if it were gone. The walls were whitewashed stone, uneven and slightly damp to the touch in winter, but now in high summer, dry and powdery under the fingertips. A single shelf held a row of tins with tea, sugar and flour, their labels worn away, and from a hook in the ceiling beam hung a cured ham wrapped in muslin, swaying almost imperceptibly in the draught from the half-open door. The floor was flagstone, worn into smooth hollows by decades of footsteps between the door, the fire, and the table, and a rag rug made of old sacking and scraps of blue cloth lay beside the hearth, its colours so faded they had become various tones of grey. Thomas set down the mug with a soft clink against the bare wood of the table and drew a slow breath. The kind of breath a man takes, not because he is tired, but because he is transitioning from one state to another, from sitting to standing, from indoors to out. He pushed his chair back, and the legs scraped gently on the stone, a sound the cottage had heard so many times it was woven into the fabric of the evening. He rose to his feet with the deliberate care of a man who trusts his body, but no longer takes it for granted, pressing his palms flat on the table for a moment before straightening fully. The light from the small window had shifted while he sat. The square of pale gold that had lain across the table now climbed halfway up the opposite wall, and he noted this without thought, his internal clock adjusting to the angle of the shadows, the way a sailor reads tides. He reached for his waistcoat, which hung over the back of the chair, a garment of brown wool that had once been a darker shade and was now mottled like the bark of an oak. He put it on slowly, one arm at a time, fastening the 4 buttons with fingers that moved by memory rather than sight, never fumbling despite their stiffness. Over the waistcoat he wore a loose jacket of heavy cotton drill, patched at the elbows, with a slightly different shade of brown, and this he left unbuttoned because the evening was still warm enough to allow it. His boots, the same pair that had stood on the doorstep, were already on his feet, the leather so supple and shaped to him that he might have been wearing them since morning without noticing. The last item was his flat cap, a tweed thing in a herringbone pattern of brown and grey, its brim stained darker where he habitually grasped it. He took it from the peg beside the door, settled it on his head with its angle just slightly tilted to the left, an adjustment so familiar it was less a choice than a fact of his body, and then he stood for a moment in the open doorway, his silhouette filling the space, one hand resting on the iron latch. The latch was cool under his palm, a horseshoe shape of black iron that had been forged by a smith whose name was now forgotten, and it moved with a smooth, heavy action that spoke of good workmanship and regular oiling. Thomas pressed the thumb piece. The mechanism clicked with a solid, metallic sound, and the door swung inward on its hinges, which he kept greased with a smear of mutton fat once a month. The door did not squeak, it never squeaked, because Thomas could not abide a noisy hinge. He stepped out onto the stone doorstep, and the first thing that met him was the quality of the light, which had shifted again, even in the short time since he had finished his tea. The apricot glow was now concentrated low on the horizon, a band no wider than a handspan, and above it the sky had deepened to a soft lavender that held the promise of stars within the hour. He paused on the doorstep, not to admire the sunset, for he had seen so many thousands of sunsets from this exact spot that they had become a familiar backdrop to his routines, but simply to let his eyes adjust and to listen to the canal before he approached it. A lock keeper learns to read the water by sound long before his eyes can tell him anything useful, and what Thomas heard now was the faint, distant trickle of a bywash somewhere upstream, the soft lapping of the lower pound against the stone wing walls, and the complete absence of any other noise that might indicate a boat, a horse, or a human being in the vicinity. Satisfied that all was as it should be, he stepped down from the doorstep onto the path that led to the lock. This path was not a formal construction, but a line of bare earth worn into the grass by his own feet over 20 years. A curved depression that swung to the right of the cottage skirted a small clump of nettles he had never bothered to dig up, and arrived at the stone coping beside the lower gates. The grass on either side of the path was long and seeded now, the tips of the rye and fescue brushing his trouser legs as he walked, and he registered the dry rustle of the stems without conscious thought, the way a man might note his own heartbeat. His boots made a soft, crunching sound on the packed earth, and every few paces a small puff of dust rose from the toe of each boot and settled again behind him. When he reached the stone coping, he stopped in the same spot where he always stopped. A stone flag that was slightly more worn than the others, and marked by a dark stain that might have been oil or might have been simply the accumulated shadow of his presence. From this position he could see the entire lock in one slow turn of his head, the lower gates directly in front of him, the long stone chamber stretching away to his left, the top gates standing dark against the glow in the west, and the upper pound beyond them, a sheet of pale water reflecting the sky. The water in the lock chamber was low, exactly level with the lower pound, and this told him that no boat had passed through in either direction since he had last emptied the lock the previous evening, which was exactly what he expected. He walked to the balance beam of the nearest lower gate and laid his right hand flat on the top surface, feeling the grain of the oak under his palm. The wood was smooth, polished not by any varnish, but by the cumulative pressure of countless hands and shoulders over the decades, and it felt cool now, though earlier in the day it would have been warm from the sun. He pressed down slightly, a gentle test, and felt the solid, unyielding resistance of the gate seated firmly in its mitre, the joint watertight and true. He did the same with the other lower gate, crossing behind the lock on the stone apron where the water churned when the paddles were open, and found that gate equally sound. This was the first of his evening checks, a ritual performed not because he expected anything to be wrong, but because the act of checking was itself a kind of conversation with the lock, a way of saying, "I am here, and everything is in order." The lock, if it could be said to have a personality, was a patient and undemanding companion. It had been built in the 1790s by the Oxford Canal Company, part of the great push to connect the coal fields of the Midlands with the markets of the South, and it had been operating without major alteration ever since. The stone was from a local quarry near Hornton, a warm brown ironstone that seemed to hold the light even on dull days, and the oak for the gates had come from the woodlands of Blenheim, planted a century before the canal was ever thought of. Thomas knew these things because he had once asked a company engineer years ago, and the answers had lodged in his mind like so much else. Facts that served no practical purpose but added texture to the world he inhabited. He turned from the lower gates and walked along the side of the locked chamber, stepping from flagstone to flagstone with a measured gait that never varied. The coping stones were dry underfoot except for a single patch near the middle of the chamber, where a small leak from the top gate left a permanent film of moisture, and here his boots left a momentary dark print that faded as he watched. The lock walls rose about 10 feet from the floor of the chamber to the coping, built with a slight batter so that they sloped inward, and the joints between the stones were filled with mortar that had been patched and repointed so many times it resembled a mosaic of different greys. In the cracks, tiny ferns had taken root, their fronds no longer than a thumb, and a single spray of toadflax with small purple and yellow flowers clung to the stone just below the coping, its roots finding purchase in what seemed like pure shadow. When he reached the top gates, he performed the same check he had made on the lower gates, placing his hand on each balance beam in turn and pressing down. The top gates were warmer, having faced the afternoon sun, and the wood here was not as smooth, the grain raised slightly in places where the weather had worked on it. He noted without concern that a small split had developed in the end grain of the right-hand balance beam, a crack no wider than a thumbnail that had been there since the spring and had not grown. He would watch it through the autumn and winter, and if it widened, he would report it to the company's carpenter when the man came through on his annual inspection. For now, it was nothing. Beside the top gate, the ground paddle gear stood in its black iron frame, and Thomas paused to inspect it more closely than he had the gates. The paddle itself, a rectangular plate of elm wood sheathed in iron, was deep underground, lowered fully into its culvert slot, and he could not see it, but he could judge its condition by the feel of the spindle when he gave the ratchet an experimental tug with his fingers. It did not move, locked securely by the pawl, and that was as it should be. The ratchet teeth, 24 of them arranged in a circle around the spindle head, were clean and free of rust, because Thomas made a point of wiping them with an oily rag every morning. The windlass hook on the wall was empty, his own windlass still hanging from his belt, a privilege of rank, so to speak. The spare windlass, kept for the use of boatmen who had lost or forgotten their own, hung on a separate hook, sunk into the mortar beside the bottom gates, and he would check that later. He continued his circuit of the lock, walking across the top gate walkway plank with the ease of long practice, his boots finding the grooves worn by his own passage without any need for balance or caution. The plank was a single balk of oak 14 inches wide and 2 inches thick, its surface roughened with shallow notches cut by an adze to give grip in wet weather, though it was dry now. Below him, the lock chamber dropped away into shadow. The water at the bottom, a dark rectangle that reflected nothing except a faint suggestion of the pale sky directly overhead. He did not look down for long. There was nothing to see in the empty lock, and the downward view always gave him a slight ache in the back of his neck, a reminder of his age. At the other side of the lock, he checked the second ground paddle, found it equally sound, and then walked back along the offside coping, which was narrower than the towpath side and less frequently used. Here the grass grew right up to the stone, and a clump of meadowsweet had seeded itself in the angle between the coping and the wing wall, its creamy flowers giving off a faint, sweet scent that mixed with the cooler smell of the water. Thomas bent, with a small grunt that was more habit than effort, and pulled a strand of weed that had wrapped itself around the pawl of the paddle gear, a green thread like a lock of hair that came away easily in his fingers. He dropped it into the water and watched it float for a moment, a tiny green scribble on the dark surface, before it slowly drifted towards the top gate and disappeared into the shadow beneath the walkway. Now he arrived back at his starting point beside the lower gates, and the circuit was complete. It was a journey he made at least 4 times a day, more often when boats were passing, and each time it was exactly the same, a closed loop that began and ended at the same worn flagstone. The repetition was not tedious to him. It was the shape of his days, as regular as the ticking of the tin clock on the mantelpiece, and it gave him the same quiet satisfaction that a stonemason might feel in laying a course of blocks perfectly true. He paused on the flagstone and looked up at the sky, which had now lost all but a single thread of gold along the horizon. The bats were out in numbers, flickering above the cutting in their jerky, soundless flight, and he watched them for a few seconds, his eyes tracking one and then another without any particular interest. They were part of the evening, the same as the wood pigeon and the robin had been, and he noted their presence as he noted everything else, a quiet filing away of the facts of the world as it presented itself to him. The lockkeeper reached to his belt and unhooked his windlass, not because he needed it, but because he wanted to check the oil on the moving parts, a task he performed at the same time every evening. The windlass was a tool of simple design, a bar of iron about 18 inches long with a socket at one end to fit over the paddle spindle and a curved handle at the other, the whole thing weighing perhaps 4 pounds. Thomas had owned this particular windlass for over 30 years, and its iron was dark with a patina that was not rust but a kind of seasoning, a deep brown black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The socket was shiny at its inner edges, where the spindle had worn the metal smooth, and the handle was polished to a high gloss by the grip of his palm, a gloss that he maintained by wiping the windlass with the same oily rag he used on the ratchets. He took the rag from his jacket pocket, a square of old cotton sheeting that was more oil than cloth by now, and passed it over the windlass in long, even strokes, turning it in his hands to reach every surface. The smell of the oil was sharp and mineral, a tang that cut through the softer scents of grass and water and stone, and it was a smell he associated with readiness, with the lock in its proper working order. When he was satisfied, he hooked the windlass back onto his belt, where it hung with a reassuring weight against his hip, and he folded the rag into a neat square and returned it to his pocket. The last check of the evening routine was the coil of rope that lay on the stone coping beside the lower gate, a length of hemp about 40 feet long and an inch thick, spliced at one end into a loop that could be dropped over a bollard. The rope was there in case a boatman needed an extra line, or in case a horse balked and needed to be led around the lock by a longer rein, or in case of any of the dozen small contingencies that arose from time to time on the canal. Thomas bent and lifted the coil, feeling its weight and its slight dampness from the evening air, and he turned it over in his hands to check for fraying. The hemp was still sound, the fibers tight and springy, and he laid it back exactly where it had been, the loops perfectly aligned, the spliced end on top. Standing on the flagstone now, with his hands loose at his sides and his weight settled evenly on both feet, Thomas let his gaze travel one more time along the length of the lock, from the lower gates, past the chamber, to the upper gates and the quiet water beyond. Everything was as it always was, as it was supposed to be. The lock was empty, the paddles were down, the gates were sealed, the sky was darkening, the bats were flying, and the thin wisp of smoke from his cottage chimney still climbed straight into the violet air. He could not know that a narrowboat was even now making its slow way along the upper pound towards him, its horse plodding along the towpath, its steerer checking the set of his tiller. He could not know that in another 20 minutes, perhaps half an hour, the sound of a hoof would reach him, and the quiet ritual of the evening would shift into the quiet ritual of the lock, filling. For now, there was only the dusk and the water and the stone, and Thomas stood in the middle of them, as he had stood for more evenings than he could count, a still figure in a still landscape, waiting without expectation. Thomas had not moved from the worn flagstone beside the lower gates, and perhaps he might have stood there until the stars were fully out had the evening remained entirely silent. But the canal was not silent for much longer. The first sign of the narrowboat came not as a sight, but as a sound, and not as a single sound, but as the faintest of rhythms, so distant and so blended with the soft noises of dusk that it took a few moments for his mind to separate it from the murmur of leaves, the ripple of water, and the quiet ticking of cooling stone. It was a soft, regular clopping, the sound of a horse's hooves on packed earth, still far away along the upper pound, somewhere beyond the top gate and the straight reach of water that led away between the hedgerows into the deepening gloom. A horse walking at a steady, unhurried pace produces a 4-beat rhythm that is as old as the canal itself, a sound that carries along the water in a peculiar way, skipping across the surface and echoing slightly against the stone walls of bridges and locks, so that a lockkeeper with ears trained by decades can hear it half a mile away. Even on a still night, Thomas tilted his head, a small movement that lifted his left ear slightly towards the upper pound, and his eyes, which had been resting on the water at his feet, grew still. He did not turn around, Not yet. There was no hurry to see what his ears had already told him. The sound was steady, not the faster trot of a horse in a hurry, nor the uneven stumble of a tired animal, but the patient, ground-covering walk of a canal horse that knew its job and had done it 1,000 times, a horse whose pace was set by the weight of a narrowboat gliding through water behind it. With each hoofful, Thomas could almost picture the way the animal's feathers, the long hair around its fetlocks, would be lifting and settling in a slow, dusty wave, and the way its head would be nodding in time with its stride, the harness leathers creaking with a tiny, repetitive note that would become audible only when the horse was much closer. After a minute, perhaps two, he turned his body slowly, letting his heels pivot on the flagstone, and faced towards the top gate. The upper pound stretched away from him like a lane of darkening water between two high hedges, its surface now the colour of pewter, where the last light caught it, and ink-black, where the shadows of the hedgerow fell. At the far end of the strait, perhaps 400 yards away, the canal bent gently to the right, around a clump of alders, and it was from behind that bend that the sound of the hooves was coming. Thomas could not yet see the horse or the boat, but he could see something else. The faintest disturbance on the water's surface near the bend, a tiny V-shaped ripple that widened as it advanced, the first messenger of the narrowboat's bow pushing through the still water. The ripple was so slight that it could have been mistaken for the wake of a moorhen paddling home to its nest. But Thomas knew the difference, and he watched it glide towards him, a silent herald that arrived several seconds before the sound of the boat itself could be heard. Gradually, very gradually, the sound of the hooves grew louder, and it was joined by a new sound, a soft, continuous hiss that was the narrowboat's bow parting the water. A loaded boat, drawing deep, would make a heavier sound, a slow, creaking displacement. But this hiss was light and high-pitched, telling Thomas that the boat was riding relatively high in the water, probably carrying a light cargo or none at all, the kind of boat that made good time because it skimmed the surface rather than ploughed through it. The hiss was a clean, slicing note, like the sound of a knife being sharpened on a very fine stone, and it grew from a whisper to a gentle, steady wash as the boat came around the bend and into the strait. Now Thomas could see the horse. It was a chestnut, its coat the colour of polished mahogany in the last of the amber light, with a broad white blaze running down its face from forehead to nose. It walked with its head low and level, the bit held loosely in its mouth, and its large dark eyes were fixed on the towpath ahead, with the calm, unfocused gaze of an animal that had long ago learned to trust the ground under its feet, and the voice of the steerer behind it. Its mane, a darker shade than its coat, hung in a thick, uneven fringe along the curve of its neck, and the feathered hair round its hooves was pale and long, almost white, stirring up tiny puffs of dust with each step. The harness was simple but well kept, the leather a deep brown with brass buckles that glinted weakly in the dusk, and from the hames a single tow line dipped in a graceful, catenary curve across the water, just barely skimming the surface in the middle before rising again to the boat's towing mast. Behind the horse, at the end of that long, sweeping line, the narrowboat itself emerged from behind the alders. It was a working boat of the typical Oxford Canal type, about 70 feet long and narrow enough to fit comfortably into a lock with barely inches to spare on either side. Its hull was painted in the traditional colours, a deep maroon below the gunwale, a band of cream bordered with green above, and around the bow a scroll of painted roses and castles, the folk art of the waterways, executed in red, yellow and white, with a careful, loving hand that spoke of a steerer who took pride in his vessel. The lettering on the bow, picked out in ornate white script with a black shadow, read Mildred, and beneath it the home port of Braunston was lettered in smaller, plainer capitals. The boat's cabin, an enclosed space at the stern with a curved wooden roof painted in the same green as the trim, had two small windows with lace curtains drawn partway back, and from inside the cabin a soft glow of lamplight showed, a warm orange point against the cooling blue of the twilight. On the cabin roof, sitting on a folded blanket with her back against the chimney, a woman was engaged in some quiet task, her head bent over her hands. She was the steerer's wife, a woman in her middle years, with hair pulled back into a neat bun under a plain cotton bonnet, and she wore a dark blue dress with the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, revealing forearms that were tanned and capable. In her hands she held a piece of mending, a shirt of some faded check pattern, and she was stitching a tear with a needle and thread. Her movements small and precise, the needle dipping and rising in a steady, hypnotic rhythm that matched the pace of the boat. From time to time she glanced up, not at the lock or the cottage or the lock-keeper, but at the horse, checking its gait and the set of the tow-line, with the automatic vigilance of someone who had spent years on the cut and knew that the smallest trouble with the line could cause the boat to sheer. She seemed to find everything satisfactory, for she returned her gaze to her stitching each time without any change of expression. At the tiller stood the steerer, a man of about 50 with a square weathered face and a heavy moustache that was more grey than brown. He wore a tweed waistcoat over a collarless shirt, the top button undone, and his trousers were of heavy corduroy that had been patched at both knees. On his head was a flat cap not unlike Thomas's own, pushed back slightly from his forehead, and in his mouth was a short clay pipe, unlit, the stem clenched between his teeth with the comfortable grip of habit. One hand rested on the brass tiller bar, a curved wooden handle polished by the grip of his palm, and the other hand was tucked into the pocket of his waistcoat, pulling the fabric slightly askew. He stood with his weight on his back foot, his body swaying almost imperceptibly to the slow, rhythmic motion of the boat as it answered the tiny variations in the tow-line tension, and his eyes, like those of his wife, swept the canal ahead with the calm, unhurried attention of a man who had nothing to fear and nowhere to be in any great hurry. The boat moved at a little less than walking pace, perhaps 2 miles an hour, so that its progress along the strait was so gradual it almost seemed still, a dark shape growing incrementally larger against the water. The ripple from its bow spread outward in a continuous, shallow wave that lapped against the stone walls of the lock approach channel with a soft, lipping sound, and small insects that had been resting on the surface scattered ahead of it, skating away on fine legs to find new stillness. The tow-line made a faint humming note as it cut through the air, a vibration so low it was more felt than heard, and every few seconds a drop of water fell from the line into the canal with a tiny, solitary plink that sounded clearly in the quiet. Thomas watched the approach without moving from his place by the lower gates. There was no need to hurry, for the boat had not yet reached the top gate, and the lock was empty and waiting. The lock-keeper's role was not to rush forward to greet the boat, but to be exactly where he was needed, at exactly the right moment, and the right moment was still some minutes away. So he stood, his hands resting lightly on the cool iron of the windlass at his belt, his eyes tracking the horse, the boat, and the steerer with the same patient attention he gave to everything. He noted the name Mildred on the bow, and recognized it as a boat he had seen before, perhaps a month ago, traveling north with a load of coal. He remembered it because the roses on the cabin panel had been freshly painted then, and they still looked bright, the red petals standing out against the cream background like small jewels. He remembered, too, the horse, for chestnuts were less common on the canal than bays or greys, and this one had a distinctive white sock on its left hind leg, a marking he could now just make out as the horse approached the wider pool of light near the lock. The light itself was changing all the while, the last band of gold on the horizon now compressed into a thin, brilliant line that flared beneath the elm trees like a burning fuse, while the rest of the sky deepened into a rich indigo from which more stars were emerging, one by one, like tiny pinpricks poked through a dark cloth. The water of the upper pound, which had been pewter, was now a deep steel blue, and the reflections of the hedgerows were no longer sharp, but smeared into long dark patches that broke apart as the boat's ripple reached them. The horse, the boat, and the figures on it were losing their color by degrees, turning into silhouettes, and the only bright points that remained were the warm orange square of the cabin window and the tiny intermittent wink of the brass buckles on the harness when the horse passed through a last shaft of light. As the boat came within 100 yards of the top gate, the steerer removed his unlit pipe from his mouth and tapped it once against the tiller bar, a small habitual gesture that produced a faint clack. He turned his head and said something to his wife, too quiet for Thomas to hear, and she looked up from her mending and nodded, then began to put her sewing things away into a small wooden box that rested beside her on the cabin roof. She folded the shirt carefully, smoothed it flat with her palm, and placed it inside the cabin through the open hatch, Then she stood up on the roof with the ease of someone accustomed to moving on a narrow, swaying surface, one hand resting on the chimney for balance. She straightened her bonnet and brushed a stray thread from her skirt, and then she looked ahead at the lock, her gaze passing over the top gate, the stone chamber, and the lockkeeper himself, taking in the scene with a single comprehensive glance that required no words. The steerer shifted his weight forward now, his stance becoming more alert, and he reached down to a cleat on the cabin roof and lifted a coiled mooring line, a thinner rope than the tow line, already spliced with an eye at one end. He held this in his left hand while his right hand remained on the tiller, and with a small practiced correction he angled the boat very slightly towards the towpath side, aiming for the wide mouth of the lock approach, where the stone walls flared outward in a gentle curve to guide arriving boats into the chamber. The horse, without any audible command, seemed to sense the change in intention. It slowed its pace just perceptibly, its ears swiveling back once towards the boat and then forward again, and it angled its own path slightly closer to the water's edge, where a stone bollard stood waiting for the mooring line. Thomas now took his first step away from the flagstone, a single, deliberate stride that began his movement towards the top gate. He did not walk quickly because there was no reason to. He walked at the same measured pace he used for everything, his boots making the same soft crunch on the path, his windlass swaying gently against his thigh. He passed the side of the locked chamber, the dark water in its depths still and silent below him, and when he reached the stone steps beside the top gate, he climbed them one at a time, his hand brushing the cold iron of the handrail that had been set into the stone for just this purpose. At the top, he stood on the wide stone apron before the gate, and from this elevated position he could see the boat clearly, now only 50 yards away, the steerer's face becoming distinct, the wife now stepping down from the cabin roof onto the stern deck, the horse's breath becoming visible as a faint plume in the cooling air. The steerer raised his hand from the tiller and lifted it in a wordless greeting, a gesture that was half a wave and half a salute, and Thomas responded with the same slow nod he had given the sunset, the pigeons and the empty lock itself, a nod that said, "I see you, and all is ready." Then the lockkeeper reached for the windlass on his belt, and the quiet ritual of the filling was about to begin. The narrow boat Mildred was now close enough that Thomas could hear the smaller sounds of its approach, the faint creak of the towing mast as it took the strain of the line, the soft splash of the bow wave against the stone approach walls, and the low, rhythmic jingle of the harness rings as the chestnut horse slowed its pace still further. He stood on the wide stone apron just before the top gate, where the ground paddle gear rose from the coping like a black iron sculpture, and he waited without impatience while the boat covered the last few yards, his windlass still hanging at his belt, and his hands resting easily at his sides. The steerer on the stern of Mildred had taken the mooring line in his left hand now, and was paying it out in loose coils, ready to drop the eye over the bollard, while his wife had stepped onto the gunwale and was holding the boat hook lightly, its brass tip catching the last of the light as she prepared to fend off if the boat drifted too close to the stone. The horse, without any audible word from anyone, stopped of its own accord just short of the top gate, its large dark eyes reflecting the pale sky, and it lowered its head to crop at the long grass on the towpath verge, the bit clinking gently against its teeth. Thomas gave the steerer the same slow nod he had given earlier, a nod so slight that it was little more than a downward tilt of the chin, and then he turned his attention to the lock. He walked the few paces to the nearest ground paddle gear, the one on the towpath side, his boots making a hollow sound on the wide flagstones. This paddle, like all the others on the lock, was of the type known as a ground paddle or sluice, a vertical sliding door of elm wood sheathed in iron that sat in a narrow slot cut into the stone of the lock wall below the waterline, and when it was raised, water from the upper pound would flow through an underground culvert built into the lock floor and emerge inside the chamber through a grating, filling the lock from below rather than over the top gates. The mechanism for raising and lowering this paddle was a rack and pinion, simple and robust, housed in a cast-iron frame about 3 feet high that stood on the coping like a squat, patient sentinel. At the top of the frame, the spindle projected horizontally, a square-section bar of iron about 1 inch across, its corners slightly rounded by decades of use, and around the spindle was fixed the ratchet wheel, a disc of iron with 24 teeth cut into its circumference, each tooth a neat, angled notch. A pawl, a hinged iron finger weighted at its tip, rested between two of the teeth, ready to drop into each successive notch and prevent the paddle from falling back under the pressure of the water. Thomas reached to his belt and took hold of the windlass, lifting it free of its hook with a movement that was as automatic as breathing. The iron was cool in his hand, cooler than the air, and the familiar weight of it settled into his palm with a rightness that came only from decades of daily use. He held it for a moment, turning it over once to check the socket, though he had checked it only minutes before, and then he stepped closer to the paddle gear and fitted the socket over the end of the spindle. The fit was snug, the squared hole of the windlass engaging with the squared end of the spindle, with a small, satisfying clink of metal on metal, and Thomas adjusted his grip on the curved handle, his right hand wrapping around the smooth iron while his left hand rested on the top of the frame to steady himself. Before he began to wind, he glanced once at the lock chamber below, and then at the boat waiting beyond the top gate, and then at the sky, which was now almost entirely the color of a slate roof except for that single thin line of gold that was shrinking into the elms. All was as it should be, and so he began. The first quarter turn of the windlass required a small, deliberate effort, not because the mechanism was stiff, but because the paddle itself was heavy and the water pressure on its face held it firmly in its closed position. As Thomas pulled the handle towards himself, the ratchet wheel turned, the first tooth slipped out from under the pole with a sharp metallic click, and the pole dropped onto the next tooth with a second, softer click. The sound was clean and precise, like the cocking of a well-made lock, and it rang out across the still water with a clarity that made the horse lift its head for a moment before returning to its grass. Thomas continued to turn the windlass, each pull of the handle producing a pair of clicks, the pawl lifting and falling, in a steady, unhurried rhythm that began to sound less like a mechanical noise and more like the heartbeat of the lock itself. The spindle turned, the pinion engaged with the rack on the paddle rod, and somewhere deep under the stone coping, in the dark, wet slot that no one had seen since the lock was built, the heavy elm paddle began to rise. The paddle did not rise quickly. It rose perhaps a quarter of an inch with each full turn of the windlass, and Thomas turned the windlass slowly, his arm moving through a steady arc that came from his shoulder and his back rather than his wrist. The resistance under his hand was constant, a firm, living pressure that communicated the weight of the water and the condition of the mechanism in a language that his muscles understood without translation. A stiff spot in the gearing, a worn tooth on the rack, a small obstruction in the paddle slot, any of these would have spoken to him through the windlass handle. But tonight the movement was smooth and even, and the message was simply, "All is well." As the paddle lifted from its seat, the water in the culvert began to move. At first there was no sound that a casual ear could detect, only a faint, distant stirring, a suggestion of motion in the darkness under the lock floor. But Thomas, whose ears were tuned to the water's every note, could hear it even before it became audible to anyone else. A low, hollow murmur, like the sound of air moving through a distant tunnel, that seemed to come from the stone itself rather than from any single point. This murmur grew as the paddle rose higher, gaining body and depth, until it resolved into a distinct rushing noise that emerged from the grating in the lock chamber floor. The water from the upper pound, finding a way through the open paddle slot and along the dark culvert, was now pouring into the empty lock, and the sound it made was a deep, liquid gurgle, the voice of water speaking to stone in a language of bubbles and eddies and gentle, persistent pressure. Inside the lock chamber, the water that had been lying still and black at the bottom began to stir. The incoming flow created a slow swirl near the grating, a circular motion that spread outward in lazy spirals, carrying with it small bits of debris that had settled on the lock floor, a fragment of waterlogged twig, a few strands of green weed, a single pale leaf that turned and turned in the current like a dancer in slow motion. The water level, which had been exactly even with the lower pound, began to rise, but so gradually that the change was almost invisible unless you watched the wet line on the stone wall, which crept upward with the patience of a shadow at sunset, a dark band of dampness widening by a finger's width every few seconds. The sound of the filling was not loud. It was a deep, continuous hush, a sound that seemed to fill the lock chamber from wall to wall and then to spill out over the coping and into the evening air, mixing with the softer sounds of the bats and the distant owl that had begun to call from the older wood. The narrowboat Mildred, still waiting outside the top gate, responded to the movement of the water with a gentle rock. The bow, which had been nosing towards the gate, lifted slightly and then settled, lifted and settled, in a rhythm that matched the pulsing of the culvert flow, and the towline, which had been slack, tightened momentarily as the boat shifted its position. The steerer, still standing at the tiller with the unlit pipe in his teeth, adjusted his weight to compensate for the motion without appearing to think about it, and his wife, still holding the boat hook, touched the stone wall once with its brass tip to keep the hull from rubbing. The horse, chewing its mouthful of grass, took a single step sideways to maintain a light tension on the towline, and then it resumed cropping, its large jaws moving in a slow, circular grind. Thomas wound the paddle only part-way open, perhaps a third of its full height, and then he stopped. He lifted the windlass from the spindle, the socket coming away with a small metallic jingle as the pawl dropped into its new position and locked the ratchet, and he stood back, one hand resting on the iron frame while the other held the windlass loosely at his side. He was listening. The water's voice at this partial opening was a low, steady roar, not the full-throated rush of a completely open paddle, but a controlled, manageable flow that filled the lock chamber at a rate he judged to be right for the conditions. Filling a lock too fast could send surges that would slam the boat against the gate or the walls. Filling it too slowly was safe, but wasteful of time, and Thomas had learned over the years exactly the right fraction of a turn that would bring the water up at a pace that was both gentle and efficient. Tonight, with no wind and no other boats waiting, he had chosen a moderate fill, and the sound told him he had chosen correctly. He walked slowly along the coping to the edge of the lock chamber and looked down into the water. The surface, which had been a flat, dark mirror only moments before, was now broken into a complex pattern of ripples and swirls, all centered on the grating near the bottom of the upstream end. The water was still dark, but now it had a living quality, a sheen of motion that caught the faint light from the sky and scattered it into 1,000 small glints. Bubbles rose from the grating in clusters, shining like tiny pearls as they ascended through the murky water and broke at the surface with a soft, collective sigh. The wet line on the stone walls had climbed noticeably, perhaps a foot, and the water was now lapping at the lower edge of the gate paddle openings, where small ferns and tufts of moss had been dry all day and were now receiving their first drink. The smell of the lock chamber had changed too. The earlier scent of cool stone and mud was now overlaid with the cleaner, fresher smell of moving water, a scent that reminded Thomas of springs and wells and the deep, unseen sources of the canal. The steerer on Mildred, seeing that the fill was well underway, stepped off the stern deck onto the towpath, leaving his wife at the tiller, and walked forward along the gunwale to the bow. He picked up the mooring line, which was still coiled loosely on the cabin roof, and he stepped ashore with an easy leap that spoke of long practice, landing lightly on the gravel beside the horse. The horse turned its head and blew a soft breath through its nostrils, a greeting that seemed to say, "I know you, and I am content." The steerer patted the animal's neck once, a brief, affectionate touch, and then he walked to the bollard beside the top gate and dropped the eye of the mooring line over it, pulling it snug with a quick, expert tug. The boat was now secured, its bow held steady against the pull of the filling water, and the steerer stood by the bollard with his arms folded, watching the lock chamber fill with the same patient attention that Thomas gave to the winding. Thomas, having satisfied himself that the water was rising as it should, returned to the ground paddle gear and checked the ratchet one more time, ensuring the pawl was seated firmly between two teeth. He then walked around the head of the lock, crossing the walkway plank over the top gate with his windlass in hand, and paused on the offside to look at the pound above. The water in the upper reach was now visibly lower by a tiny amount, drawn down by the filling of the lock, and a faint current had developed near the top gate, a slow draw that pulled small floating objects gently towards the paddle openings. A water beetle, its body a glossy black, was skating on the surface near the gate, and it paused as the current caught it, its legs working for a moment to hold its position before it allowed itself to be carried gently backwards, drifting across the entrance to the lock like a tiny black boat. Thomas watched it go, and then he turned his attention back to the lock chamber, where the water was now rising more rapidly as the paddle, partially open, continued to deliver its steady flow from the culvert below. The light now was almost entirely gone from the sky, replaced by a deep, velvety blue in which the stars were fully present, scattered like handfuls of salt across the heavens. The water in the lock chamber reflected these stars, but brokenly, the ripples turning each point of light into a short, wavering line. The sound of the filling continued, steady and soothing, and Thomas stood on the offside coping with his windlass hanging from his belt, a dark figure against the dark sky, waiting for the moment when the water would tell him it was time to open the second paddle. The lock was filling, the boat was waiting, the horse was grazing, and the summer dusk had given way to the first true hour of darkness, all in the slow, unhurried rhythm that the canal had known for 100 years. The water in the lock chamber was speaking now, and its voice filled the stone enclosure with a continuous, layered murmur that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Thomas stood on the offside coping, one hand resting on the cold iron of the topgate balance beam, and let the sound wash over him without the need to analyze it, the way a man might listen to rain on a roof while half asleep. The dominant note was the deep, hollow rush from the culvert grating at the bottom of the chamber, a sound that was more felt than heard, a low, constant thrum that travelled up through the soles of his boots and into the bones of his legs, as if the earth itself were humming along with the water. Above this bass note, there were lighter and more delicate tones, the soft, rhythmic lapping of the rising water against the stone walls, producing a gentle, slurred noise that varied slightly as it encountered the irregularities of the masonry and the occasional higher-pitched gurgle that announced the release of a trapped air pocket from inside the culvert, a bubbly plop that rose and burst at the surface before merging back into the general rush. The sound was not loud in any harsh or startling way. It was a controlled, purposeful noise, the sound of a mechanism doing exactly what it was designed to do, and its volume was steady, a comfortable, room-filling presence rather than a roar. As the water level climbed inch by patient inch, the acoustics of the lock chamber shifted subtly, the pitch of the echoes changing because the empty space above the water was shrinking, compressing the sound waves and giving them a slightly closer, more intimate quality. A person standing at the top gate might hear the filling as a muffled, booming resonance, while someone on the coping, like Thomas, heard a clearer, more direct version of the same song, with the lip of the stone reflecting some of the sound back towards the water and the open sky absorbing the rest. Thomas paid no conscious attention to these nuances, but his body acknowledged them all the same, the fibers of his muscles staying relaxed rather than tensed, his breathing slow and even, because the sound of the filling lock was for him, as for all lock keepers, the sound of order, of things proceeding as they should. A lock filling correctly had a voice that was full and round. A lock filling badly, with a jammed paddle or a partially blocked culvert, had a thinner, harsher voice, and Thomas would have heard that wrongness immediately, the way a mother hears a false note in a child's cry, even from across a field. Tonight, the voice was perfect, deep and rich, and he stood within it as within a familiar room, his mind quiet and his eyes resting on the darkening water without any need to focus. The narrowboat Mildred, moored securely to the bollard on the towpath side, responded to the filling in a slow, pendulous rhythm, its bow rising and falling with the gentle surge of the incoming water. The movement was so slight that it would have been invisible to a casual glance, but if you watched the boat's painted scrollwork against the stone of the gate, you could see the roses and castles lift by the width of a finger, and then settle, lift and settle, in a cadence that matched the pulse of the culvert flow. The steerer, still standing beside the bollard with his arms folded, had lit his pipe now, and the tiny orange glow of the bowl brightened with each draw, and then dimmed, brightened and dimmed, casting a faint, warm light on the underside of his chin and making the grey in his moustache glint like frost on a twig. The smoke from the pipe rose in a thin, blue-grey ribbon that twisted once and then dissolved into the larger darkness, its scent sharp and sweet, a thread of burned Virginia tobacco that wove itself into the cooler smells of water and wet stone and the green breath of the grass on the towpath. His wife had remained on the stern deck, the tiller held loosely in her hands, though there was little for her to do while the boat was tied up and the lock was still closed. She had set down the boathook and was now simply watching the water rise inside the chamber, her face calm and unreadable in the dim light, her bonnet a pale oval, that caught the last reflection of the fading west. From time to time she glanced along the length of the boat, checking the fenders, which were loops of old rope hung over the hull to prevent the paint from scraping against the stone. And they were all hanging correctly, each one just touching the wall with a gentle, cushioning pressure. The boat's cabin lamp, burning steadily on its bracket inside the small window, sent a square of warm yellow light out across the water, and where the light fell on the disturbed surface, it broke into 100 shifting golden splinters that danced and skittered with the ripples. On the towpath, the chestnut horse had finished its mouthful of grass and was now standing with one hind leg slightly cocked, resting the hoof on its toe, the equine equivalent of a man leaning against a wall with his hands in his pockets. Its head was lowered, its eyes half closed, and its ears were set at a relaxed outward angle, flicking once or twice at the sound of a distant night insect, but otherwise perfectly still. The tow line, which ran from its harness to the towing mast at the bow of Mildred, was slack now, dipping into the water near the boat and then rising again in a shallow curve, the fibers of the hemp dark with moisture and giving off a faint, damp smell. Every now and then the horse shifted its weight, the leather of its harness creaking with a small particular sound, and the brass rings on the hames chimed together briefly, like tiny bells before falling silent. The filling of the lock continued at its measured pace, the water rising not with any sudden leaps or starts, but with the steady, incremental progress of a clock hand. The wet line on the stone walls had now climbed past the halfway point of the chamber, and the surface of the water was perhaps 5 feet below the coping, its color changing as it deepened. From black it had become a moving, translucent murk, and as it rose still higher, it began to take on a greenish tint, not the bright green of summer leaves, but the softer, grayer green of canal water that had traveled through miles of clay and chalk, carrying a fine suspension of silt that gave it body and weight. The small objects that had been swirling near the grating were now caught in a wider, slower circulation, drifting in a clockwise direction around the lock chamber, and among them Thomas noticed a single white petal from the meadow sweet on the offside, spinning gently in an eddy, and a small water beetle that was paddling briskly against the current, with no apparent destination. The sound of the filling, having reached its steady state, now seemed to establish itself as a permanent feature of the evening, a backdrop against which all the other sounds played. The pipe smoke rose, the horse breathed, the boat rocked, and through it all the deep, rushing murmur of the water filled the silence without breaking it, because silence, Thomas understood, was not the absence of sound, but the absence of discord, and this sound was nothing if not harmonious. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a movement so small that it did not alter his silhouette, and he felt the windlass against his thigh, its iron still cool despite the warmth of his body, waiting for the moment when he would need it again. Time passed without any marker except the rising water. The bats had now become fully active, flickering through the air above the lock, cutting in their twitching, unpredictable flight, and Thomas could hear the very faint, high-pitched clicks of their echolocation if he listened carefully, a sound right at the edge of human hearing, like the ringing of tiny crystal glasses. An owl, perhaps the same one that had called earlier from the alder wood, hooted once from somewhere beyond the cottage, a long, soft note that swelled and then faded, leaving behind a small hollow of quiet before the water sounds rushed back in to fill the gap. The stars, which had been pale and tentative when the first paddle was lifted, were now bright and hard, the Milky Way a faint, dusty stripe across the center of the sky, and every so often a shooting star scratched a brief silver line across the darkness before vanishing without a trace. The steerer knocked the ash from his pipe against the heel of his boot, a brief, sharp tap that was the loudest sound in the immediate world. And then he tucked the pipe into his waistcoat pocket and walked slowly back along the gunwale to the stern of the boat. He exchanged a few quiet words with his wife, their voices too low to carry across the water, and then she handed him the tiller and stepped down into the cabin, her head disappearing through the hatch, and a moment later the glow of the lamp inside brightened as she adjusted the wick. The steerer took up his position at the tiller once more, his hand finding the worn curve of the brass bar with the ease of habit, and he looked ahead at the top gate, watching the water level rise towards the mark that he knew by heart, the point at which it would be level with the upper pound, and the gates could be opened. Thomas, on the offside, also watched the water, but his attention was now turning to the second paddle. The lock was a little more than half full, the turbulence from the single paddle having spread itself throughout the chamber in a pattern that he could read from the surface ripples. With only one paddle open, the flow was slightly uneven, the water entering mostly from one side and creating a long, slow swirl that made the boat tug very gently at its mooring line, a pull that the steerer had already compensated for with a minute adjustment of the tiller. To bring the water up evenly for the final stage of the fill, Thomas would soon need to open the second ground paddle on the other side, balancing the flow and calming the chamber, and the moment for that was approaching, though it was not quite here yet. He waited, as he always waited, for the feel of the lock to tell him, a subtle shift in the sound or the vibration that would announce that the time had come. The horse, still resting on the towpath, stretched its neck down and blew a long, fluttering breath through its nostrils, a sound that was half a sigh and half a snort, and then it lifted its head and looked directly at Thomas with its large liquid eyes, holding his gaze for a long moment before turning away to nibble at a tuft of grass it had previously overlooked. Thomas returned the look without expression, but something in him acknowledged the animal's presence as a fellow creature of the canal, one that understood waiting as thoroughly as he did himself. The lock-keeper and the horse had stood beside each other at this same gate on many evenings, though never the same horse twice, and yet there was a kinship in their shared patience, a silent recognition that all things arrived in their own time. Now the water had risen high enough that its voice was beginning to change, the deep, hollow rumble from the culvert becoming slightly less resonant as the outlet grating submerged more deeply, while the lapping against the walls grew softer, the distance between the surface and the coping narrowing. The wet line was now only about 3 feet below Thomas's boots, and he could see the stone below the waterline clearly, its colour a darker, richer brown than the dry stone above, with the mortar line showing as pale stripes and the small ferns that had been dry all day waving gently in the current like feathers under water. The water itself was clearer now, the silt having mostly settled, and in the lamplight from the boat cabin Thomas could see the shapes of the stones on the lock floor, their edges softened by a century of water and the slow growth of moss. The moment to open the second paddle had almost arrived, and Thomas uncrossed his arms and rolled his shoulders once, a small preparatory movement before stepping away from the balance beam and starting to walk back across the top gate walkway to the towpath side. The walkway was dry and solid under his boots, the notches in the oak providing a sure grip, and the drop below him, which had been a dark emptiness when the lock was empty, was now a pool of moving, living water that reflected the stars in swaying fragments. He crossed without haste, one foot after the other, and when he reached the towpath coping, he paused and looked at the second ground paddle gear, its black iron frame standing like a twin to the first, its spindle waiting for the windlass that still hung at his belt. The lock was filling, the boat was waiting, and the rhythm of the evening continued undisturbed, as steady as the water's voice and as calm as the summer stars. The water in the lock chamber had reached a point where its rise was no longer a matter of filling an empty space, but a slow, careful bringing together of two levels that were nearly equal. Standing on the towpath coping beside the first ground paddle, Thomas could see that the wet line on the stone wall was now only a couple of feet below the upper pound level, the dark water lapping with a gentler rhythm, its earlier turbulence smoothed into a softer, wider motion that moved the whole body of the lock in a quiet, pendulous sway. The sound from the single open paddle had mellowed too, the deep booming of the early fill giving way to a lighter, more liquid rush, the kind of sound a stream makes over a shallow fall, continuous and even and without any strain. The time had come to open the second paddle, and Thomas knew it not by any clock or measurement, but by the feel of the lock under his boots and the tone of the water against his ears, a tone that now said, "I am ready for the balance." He lifted the windlass from his belt once more, the iron cool and smooth, and he paused for a moment to wipe the socket with the corner of his oily rag before fitting it over the spindle of the second ground paddle. The second paddle gear stood on the opposite side of the lock, across the head of the chamber, and to reach it he had to walk around the lock rather than across the walkway, because the offside coping on the far side was accessed by a narrow stone path that curved behind the top gate and along the wing wall. He set off at his measured pace, his boots making a soft, gritty sound on the flagstones, each step a small, distinct event that echoed faintly against the stone walls, and then faded into the water's murmur. The path took him past the top gate balance beam, where he ran his hand along the smooth oak out of habit, feeling the familiar grain, and then behind the gate itself, where the stone was darker and carried the cool, damp scent of shadowed places that never saw the sun. Here the ground was slightly uneven, the flagstones having settled over the decades into a gentle, rolling topography that his feet navigated without thought, finding the dips and rises as a tongue finds a familiar tooth. He swapped the windlass from his right hand to his left as he rounded the corner, a simple exchange that left his dominant hand free to steady himself on the iron handrail set into the stone, and then he was on the offside coping, facing the second paddle gear with the dark water of the lock chamber directly below him, and the narrowboat Mildred a soft silhouette against the starry sky across the way. He fitted the windlass onto the spindle of the second paddle with the same precise, easy motion he had used before, the squared socket engaging with a small clean click, and he settled his grip on the curved handle, his left hand now doing the work that his right had done earlier because he had not bothered to swap the windlass back, a small asymmetry that his body accepted without complaint. The first turn of the second paddle was always slightly different from the first turn of the first, because the water in the chamber was already moving, the pressure on the paddle face not the dead weight of a closed culvert, but a live flowing pressure that shifted as the paddle began to rise, and Thomas felt this difference as a slight vibration in the handle, a trembling that travelled up the iron and into his palm like the quiver of a living thing. He wound slowly, the ratchet clicking its paired notes, and as the second paddle lifted from its seat, the voice of the water changed at once, deepening and broadening, the single stream from the first culvert now joined by a second stream from the opposite side, the two flows meeting in the middle of the lock chamber with a soft, confused swirl that quickly resolved into a smooth, unified rise. The combined sound was richer now, a chorus where before there had been a solo, and Thomas stood with his head slightly tilted, listening to the way the two culverts sang together in a harmony that was not quite a unison, their voices slightly offset by the different lengths of the underground channels, creating a subtle, wavering beat that pulsed against the stone like a slow, deep breath. The water, receiving this balanced inflow from both sides, lost the last of its earlier swirl and settled into a flat, even surface that rose without a ripple, the only sign of motion being the faint, glassy trembling of the reflections as the level climbed. The boat Mildred, still moored to the bollard, now floated so calmly that its painted roses were reflected almost perfectly in the dark water, their red and white petals duplicated in a wavering mirror image that trembled only when a bat swooped low enough to stir the air. On the stern deck, the steerer had taken out his pipe again, though this was not the same pipe he had smoked earlier, for that one was still cooling in his waistcoat pocket. This was a second pipe, a shorter, stubbier one, with a bowl carved into the shape of a tiny acorn, and he filled it from a leather pouch that he drew from his jacket, tamping the tobacco down with a thumb that moved in a slow, practiced circle. He struck a match against the rough patch on the side of the matchbox, and the flare of the sulphur was a brief, bright bloom of yellow light that illuminated his face from below, catching the lines around his eyes and the deep grooves that ran from his nose to the corners of his mouth. The light flared for a second, 2 seconds, and then faded to a soft orange glow as the tobacco caught, and he drew on the stem with a gentle bubbling sound, the smoke rising to join the velvet darkness overhead. The scent of the fresh tobacco, slightly different from the first, had a sweeter, more honeyed note, and it drifted across the locked chamber to where Thomas stood on the offside, mixing with the clean smell of the moving water and the faint earthy perfume of the damped stone. Now the water level had risen to within a foot of the upper pound, and the lock chamber was no longer a deep stone well, but a shallow, dark pool, whose surface trembled just below the lip of the top gate sill. At this stage, the filling required an even finer touch, because the final inches of rise were the ones that placed the greatest strain on the mitre gates, the water pressure on both sides equalizing in a slow, silent negotiation of forces that could, if mishandled, cause the gates to shudder or jam. Thomas wound the second paddle only a few more turns, bringing it up to roughly the same height as the first, and then he stopped and lifted the windlass from the spindle, letting the pawl drop into place with a soft, definitive click. He did not walk back around the lock immediately, but stayed on the offside coping, one hand on the paddle frame, feeling the vibration of the water coursing through the iron and into his bones, a vibration that was now becoming fainter as the pressure differential decreased. The top mitre gates, which had been holding back the weight of the upper pound all through the fill, began to respond to the changing pressures with small, subtle movements. A lock gate is not a rigid barrier, but a living structure, its oak timbers swelling and shrinking with the seasons, its iron straps flexing under load, and as the water inside the chamber rose to meet the level outside, the force pushing the gates together from the uphill side began to ease. Thomas could hear this easing as a faint, intermittent creaking, the sound of the mitre posts settling into a new alignment, the timber fibers adjusting to the reduced strain. One of the balance beams, the longer one on the towpath side, gave a soft, wooden knock, the sound a door makes when a draft catches it and then lets it go, and then it fell silent again. The gate paddles, which were still closed, rattled very slightly in their iron guides, a tiny rapid chattering that lasted only a second, and stopped when the pressure found a new equilibrium. The steerer, hearing these sounds from his position at the tiller, removed his pipe from his mouth and looked at the top gate with the assessing eye of a man who had steered a narrowboat through more locks than he could count. He saw the balance beam settle, saw the water trembling just below the sill, and he knew that the lock was almost ready. He called something softly to his wife, who was still in the cabin, and her head appeared through the hatch, her bonnet off now, and her hair loosened slightly from its bun. She looked at the water, nodded, and then climbed onto the stern deck, picking up the boat hook and moving forward along the gunwale to the bow, where she stood ready to fend off when the gates opened. The horse, still on the towpath, had lifted its head at the sound of the creaking gate, and its ears swiveled forward, its attention sharpening slightly, as if it knew that the long wait was nearly over and that it would soon be asked to lean into the collar once more. Thomas now walked back to the first paddle on the towpath side, retracing his steps around the head of the lock with the same measured pace, his windlass still in his left hand, because he had not bothered to swap it back again. When he reached the first ground paddle, he bent and inspected the ratchet, satisfying himself that the pawl was still securely engaged, and then he gave the windlass a final quarter turn on the spindle, lifting the paddle by a tiny fraction more, an adjustment so small that it barely changed the sound of the water, but was enough to bring the fill rate to a perfect, glassy smoothness. He stood back and watched the water for a full, slow minute, his eyes tracing the line where the surface met the top gate sill, and he saw it rise that last inch with a slowness that was almost ceremonial, the water creeping, pausing, creeping again, until it was exactly level with the upper pound, the two surfaces merging into a single unbroken plane that stretched away into the darkness. At the moment of perfect level, the water inside the lock and the water outside the lock became one body, and a profound stillness fell over the chamber. The rush from the culverts, which had been the constant companion of the last quarter hour, dropped away to a faint, distant trickle, and then even that faded, leaving only the soft lapping of the water adjusting to its new equilibrium, a sound so quiet it was barely there, like the breathing of a sleeping child. The boat Mildred, now floating on water that was no longer rising, settled into an absolute rest, its hull motionless, its reflections unbroken, and the steerer let out a slow breath that he might not have known he was holding. The balance beams of the top gates, relieved of their differential pressure, gave one last, gentle creak and then was silent, and in the quiet that followed, Thomas could hear the horse blow through its nostrils, a soft, fluttering sound that seemed to express a patient satisfaction. The lock was full. The water had risen evenly, the second paddle had done its work, and the chamber now held a single, continuous sheet of dark water that reflected the starry sky in a perfect, trembling mirror. Thomas let his hand rest on the windlass for a moment longer, feeling the cool iron under his palm, and then he turned to face the steerer, who was looking at him from the stern of Mildred with an expression of calm readiness. The next step would be to open the top gates, but for now, in the deep quiet of the full lock, there was only the water, and the night, and the patient figures of the horse, the boat, and the lock-keeper, suspended in a moment of perfect stillness at the end of the fill. The lock chamber was nearly full now, the water only a whisper below the level of the upper pound, its dark surface trembling perhaps 2 inches beneath the stone sill of the top gate, and Thomas, who had been standing by the ground paddle gear with his windlass still in hand, let his gaze travel slowly across the face of the gate to the smaller iron fittings that were set into the balance beams, the gate paddles. These were different from the ground paddles he had been working until now, for while the ground paddles fed the lock through underground culverts that delivered water from below, the gate paddles were mounted directly in the upper portion of the mitre gates themselves. Their rectangular openings cut right through the oak and fitted with sliding plates of iron-shod elm that, when lifted, allowed water from the pound to flow through the gates at the very top of the chamber, spilling gently over the sill and bringing the final inch of rise with a delicate surface-feeding plate that calmed the water rather than stir-bearing it. The paddles were operated by a smaller version of the rack and pinion mechanism. The spindles set into a cast iron housing that was bolted to the inner face of the balance beam, and the windlass would fit the same squared end, though the effort required to turn it was lighter, the paddle itself being no bigger than a dinner plate and the pressure against it at this stage of the fill being minimal. A soft, steady push rather than deep weight of a full pound. Thomas walks to the balance beam of the towpath side gate, his boots making the familiar gritty sound on the flagstones, and he paused beside the heavy oak timber, resting his free hand on its polished top while he looked down into the lock chamber to confirm what his ears had already told him. The water was so close to the sill that the reflections of the stars were now almost unbroken, their light trembling only at the very edges where the faintest ripple persisted. A ripple that came not from the culvert flow, which she'd stand it went at Hampton. The steerer had seen Thomas move to the gate paddle and understood, without any word being spoken, that the final stage of the filling was about to begin, and so he had knocked out his pipe against the tiller bar, tucked it into his waistcoat pocket, and taken up a firmer grip on the brass handle, his feet planted a little wider, his body angled forward as if he were already willing the boat into the lock. His wife, still on the bow with the boat hook, had called something quietly to the horse, and the horse, responding to her voice, had taken a single step forward, tightening the tow line by the smallest degree, its ears pricked and its dark eyes watching the top gate with an attention that was almost a question. Thomas set the windlass onto the gate paddle spindle, the socket slipping over the squared iron, with a small, neat clink, and he began to wind, turning the handle in a slow, steady circle that was even gentler than the winding he had done on the ground paddles, because the gate paddle required no force to lift, only a smooth, even rotation that drew the paddle plate up in its iron guides by fractions of an inch with each turn. The ratchet here was finer, the teeth closer together, and the clicks came faster, a soft, rapid ticking that was less the sound of heavy machinery and more the sound of a clock being wound, a precise, unhurried tick-tick that blended with the quiet of the night. As the paddle rose from its seat, the water that had been pressing against the outer face of the gate found a new passage, and it began to flow through the rectangular opening with a sound that was entirely different from the deep rush of the culverts, a lighter, higher sound, a liquid chuckle that spilled over the stone sill in a thin, transparent sheet no thicker than a pane of glass and fell into the lock chamber with a soft, splashing murmur like the voice of a very small waterfall. The sheet of water caught the starlight as it fell, turning into a shimmering veil of silver that broke into droplets at the bottom and then smoothed immediately into the larger body of the lock, and the surface of the water, which had been trembling, began to flatten perceptibly, the ripples dying out from the center outward as the new, gentle inflow spread across the top of the chamber and pressed everything into stillness. The gate itself, under the changing pressure, gave a low, almost imperceptible groan, the sound of its seasoned oak timbers adjusting to the slight shift in load as the water on both sides approached perfect equality, and Thomas felt the vibration of that sound through the balance beam and into his palm, a deep, resonant hum that was gone almost before he had registered it. The second gate, the one on the offside that he had not yet touched, creaked in sympathy, its mitre post moving against its partner by the thickness of a playing card, and a tiny bubble of air, trapped for perhaps the whole of the fill, escaped from the joint with a soft, plosive sigh. The steerer on Mildred watched the gate paddle opening with the calm, assessing eye of a man who had seen this 1,000 times, and he called something in a low voice to his wife, who nodded and stepped off the bow onto the towpath, where she took the horse's bridle gently and led it forward another 2 paces, positioning it so that the tow line would draw the boat cleanly through the gate opening when the moment came. Thomas wound the gate paddle fully open. the spindle coming to a gentle stop against its topmost bearing with a faint, solid thud that he felt rather than heard, and then he lifted the windlass from the spindle, letting the pawl click into place on the ratchet with a definitive, metallic note. The water continued to flow through the open paddle, the thin silver sheet pouring over the sill with a steady, murmuring chuckle. And the level inside the lock rose those last 2 inches with a slowness that was almost imperceptible, the surface creeping up the stone until it kissed the underside of the sill, and then, with a soft, wet, barely audible sound, merged with the water of the upper pound into a single, continuous plane that stretched away into the darkness without a seam or a break. The flow through the gate paddle did not stop when the levels equalized, for water has no sense of enough, but it slowed to a gentle, drifting seepage that spread across the surface in a glassy circular motion. And Thomas stood watching it for a long moment, his hand still resting on the iron housing, while the last of the ripples flattened and vanished, and the lock chamber became a perfect mirror once more. He then removed his hand from the gate paddle and walked around the head of the lock to the offside balance beam, crossing the walkway plank with his windlass swinging lightly at his side. And he went to the second gate paddle, which was still closed, its iron spindle waiting in its housing, with the same patient stillness that characterized everything on the canal that night. He fitted the windlass, began to wind, and the same soft ticking started up, the paddle lifting in its guides with a smoothness that spoke of regular oiling at a well-made mechanism, the water on the outside of the gate flowing through the opening as soon as the paddle cleared its seat, joining the flow from the first gate paddle in a gentle, symmetrical feeding that brought the last possible equilibrium to the lock chamber. The sound of the 2 gate paddles flowing together was a light, continuous murmur, a sound like a conversation between 2 quiet voices, and under its influence the surface of the water inside the lock grew so still that it was impossible to tell where the water ended and the reflected sky began, the stars shining up from below with a clarity that matched the stars above, the Milky Way a double band of faint light that seemed to pass through the very stone of the lock. The top mitre gates, now experiencing perfectly balanced pressure on both faces, relaxed fully, their timbers settling with a series of tiny, creaking sighs, and the balance beams, which had been slightly sprung under the differential load, straightened by the smallest of degrees, a movement that was visible only if you had been watching them closely, as Thomas had. He lifted the windlass from the second gate paddle spindle, let the pawl engage, and then he stood back and surveyed the lock chamber with a long, slow look that took in the water, the gates, the boat, the horse, and the dark shapes of the hedgerows, all of it exactly as it should be. The lock was full, not merely nearly full, but completely and perfectly full, the water lying in the chamber as flat and even as a sheet of polished slate, and the narrowboat Mildred, still moored to the bollard, floated on that water with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural, as if the boat were not a vessel but a part of the lock itself, a painted shape suspended in the dark mirror. On the towpath the horse shifted its weight and blew a soft breath through its nostrils, a sound that was half a sigh and half a signal, and its ears flicked forward as it looked at the balance beam that was about to be pushed open. The steerer's wife, still holding the bridle, murmured a quiet word to the animal and gave its neck a gentle stroke, and the horse, soothed, dropped its head slightly and waited. The steerer himself had straightened to his full height on the stern deck, his pipe tucked away, his hands both on the tiller now, and he glanced across at Thomas with a look that was not impatient but simply acknowledging, the kind of look that passes between men who work the same water and understand the same rhythms, a look that said, "I am ready when you are." Thomas met that look with his usual slow nod, and then he reached to his belt, lifted the windlass, and hung it on the leather loop that was stitched to the waistband of his trousers, the iron clinking softly against itself as it settled into place. The winding was done, the paddles were open, the lock was full, and all that remained was to open the gates and let the waiting boat pass through. But that was a different motion, one that required no windlass, only the slow, heavy push of a shoulder against oak, and Thomas stood for a moment longer on the offside coping, the smell of the water and the tobacco and the cool night air all mingling around him, while the stars turned silently overhead and the summer darkness deepened into the full quiet of the night. Thomas stood for a moment longer on the offside coping, his windlass now hanging quietly at his belt, and his hands resting one on top of the other against the small of his back, a posture he often assumed in these brief intervals between actions, when the lock was waiting and the water was still. The night had deepened fully by now, the last thread of amber gone from the horizon these many minutes past, and the sky was a dense dark blue that held the stars in a thick scattering, as if a hand had flung a handful of salt across a slate table. The water in the lock chamber, now perfectly level with the water in the upper pound, lay so flat and unbroken that it was impossible to tell where the canal ended and its reflection began. The whole of the lock mouth transformed into one seamless circular plane of darkness that held the stars both above and below, twin constellations trembling only when a bat cut too low and sent a single imperceptible ripple spreading outward in a ring of silver that was gone almost before it began. The narrowboat Mildred, still tied to the bollard on the towpath, seemed to float not on water but on a bed of night sky, its painted roses and castles duplicated with such clarity that they looked like a deck of ornate playing cards laid face up on a polished table, and the lamplight from the cabin window burned as a warm, steady amber thumbprint on the dark, with its own perfect reflection reaching down towards the bottom of the lock as far as the eye could follow. The steerer had not moved from his place at the tiller, though he had shifted his weight from his back foot to his front foot in a small, telling adjustment that spoke of readiness, and the bowl of his pipe, now empty and cold, was tucked back into the deep pocket of his waistcoat, where it would wait until the boat was through the lock and back on the open pound. His wife stood beside the horse on the towpath, her hand resting lightly on the animal's warm neck just below the mane, and the horse itself had raised its head and was looking directly at the balance beam of the top gate with its large liquid eyes, its ears pricked forward and its nostrils widening slightly to take in the scent of the wet stone and the fresh water and the particular metallic tang of the iron paddle gear. Everyone and everything that was part of this slow ceremony had arrived at the same understanding. The filling was complete, the water was level, and the next movement belonged to the lock-keeper and to the heavy oak gates. Thomas lowered his hands from his back and walked slowly around the head of the lock, crossing the stone apron behind the top gates with a step that was neither hurried nor hesitant. The sound of his boots on the flagstones, a steady, muted counterpoint to the soft murmur of the gate paddles that were still open, their thin silver sheets feeding the last possible equilibrium into the chamber. He passed the offside balance beam and stepped onto the walkway plank that spanned the empty space above the lock, and for a moment his silhouette was suspended against the starry sky, a dark shape moving across the face of the night before he reached the towpath coping and descended the single stone step onto the wide, worn flagstones where the approach channel widened out into the mouth of the lock. The first gate he would open was the towpath side gate, the one whose balance beam stretched out over the water like a long wooden arm, and he went to it now, the oak dark and solid and familiar under his gaze, its grain a series of fine, parallel lines that ran the length of the beam from the mitre post to the iron handle that dangled at its tip. Before he touched the beam, he paused and ran the flat of his hand across the end grain at the very tip, a place where the wood had been cut across the growth rings and sanded smooth, and the surface, though weathered, was as dense and cool as a stone, with a faint oily sheen that came from decades of hands pressing it in just this way. He then stepped around to the side of the beam where the iron strap hinge was fastened, a long black bar of wrought iron that ran from the gatepost down into the stone quoin, and he checked that the pintle, the iron pin on which the gate turned, was still seated firmly in its socket by giving the beam a very gentle experimental push with one hand. The beam shifted perhaps the width of a blade of grass and then stopped, and Thomas felt the deep solid resistance that told him the gate was still resting firmly against its mitre partner, the joint still tight despite the equal pressure, and he knew that a proper push would be needed to start the movement. Not a sudden heave, but a steady, sustained pressure that would overcome the inertia of the massive oak without sending any shudder through the water. He set his right shoulder against the balance beam at the point where the wood was slightly hollowed from years of shoulders, doing exactly this, a shallow depression that fit the curve of his joint as neatly as a cup fits a ball, and he planted his left foot a little forward on the flagstone, his right foot back, his body angled so that the push would come from his legs and his back, rather than from his arms alone. His hands he placed flat on the top of the beam, one beside the other, not gripping but simply resting, the way a man might rest his hands on a table while he gathered his thoughts, and then he began to lean. The force traveled from the sole of his back foot, through the muscles of his calf and thigh, into his hip, and then his back and shoulder, a slow, steady chain of effort that built gradually, without any suddenness, the kind of push that a car horse gives to a heavy wagon when it first leans into the collar. The balance beam resisted for a long suspended moment, during which the only sound was the soft, continuous murmur of the gate paddles and the distant, rhythmic chirping of a cricket somewhere in the hedge. Then, with a deep, grinding note that seemed to rise up from the very foundations of the lock, the gate began to move. The sound was not loud or harsh, but low and resonant, a sound that combined the scrape of iron on stone as the pintle turned in its socket, the groan of seasoned oak fibers flexing under their own weight, and the wet, sucking sigh of the mitre joint parting as the two gate leaves separated by the first fraction of an inch. Water, which had been held in the narrow gap between the mitre posts by capillary action, dripped down the face of the gate in a sudden silver trickle that splashed into the lock chamber with a sound like a handful of pebbles dropped into a pond, and then the trickle became a thin, steady stream that poured from the parting joint as the gap widened, a curtain of water that fell in a continuous wavering sheet and caught the starlight as it descended. Thomas continued to push, his shoulder pressed firmly into the worn hollow, his body moving forward with the beam at the slowest possible walking pace, each inch of the arc marked by a subtle change in the sound of the pentle and a slight rhythmic vibration that travelled up through his shoulder and into his chest. The balance beam, as it swung outward over the lock chamber, described a long, steady circle whose radius was the width of the gate itself, and as it moved, the gate leaf turned on its hinge, the massive rectangle of oak revolving in its stone socket with a ponderous, deliberate grace that made it seem almost weightless, as if the water itself were helping to float it open. The iron strap hinges, which had been dark and quiet, now shone faintly in the lamplight from the boat, their surfaces slick with water and old grease, and the rows of bolt heads that fastened them to the wood glinted one by one as they passed through the glow. The water inside the lock chamber, disturbed by the opening of the gate, did not splash or ripple in any energetic way, but simply shifted, the entire surface tilting by a tiny, almost imperceptible degree as the volume displaced by the moving gate found its new equilibrium, a readjustment that happened so smoothly it looked like a sheet of silk being stretched and then relaxed. The reflections of the stars swayed once all together as if the sky itself had taken a slow, deep breath, and then they steadied again, finding their old positions with a precision that seemed impossible. The boat Mildred, still tied to the bollard, rocked once, its bow lifting by no more than the width of a thumb, and then it settled, the tow line tightening slightly as the horse, on the towpath, took a small step backward to keep the tension even. When the first gate had been pushed open to its full extent, the balance beam coming to rest against the stone wing wall with a soft, cushioned thud that was more a felt vibration than a heard noise, Thomas stood away from it and let his shoulder drop, a single deep breath lifting his chest and then falling. The gate now lay flat against the lock wall, its inner face wet and glistening, the mitre post exposed to the night air with its iron strapping dark and its wooden edge showing the clean, straight line where it had been pressed against its partner's mitre face, a line as true as a ruled mark. Water still dripped from the lower edge of the gate into the lock, a slow, rhythmic pattering that made small overlapping circles on the surface, and the smell of wet oak and canal water, fresh and cool, rose from the opening in a soft, invisible cloud. Thomas did not pause for long. He turned from the open gate and walked to the walkway plank that crossed the lock above the water, a narrow bridge of oak with its adze-cut notches catching the starlight faintly, and he stepped up onto it without hesitation, his boots finding the familiar worn grooves as naturally as water finds a channel. Below him, the locked chamber was a dark rectangle of water that held the night sky in its depths, and above him the real sky, pressed down with its freight of stars, so that walking the plank felt for a moment like walking through the middle of the universe, suspended between two equal infinities. He crossed in 6 steady paces, the plank flexing very slightly under his weight, with a quiet wooden creak that was the only sound in the immediate world. And then he was on the offside coping, facing the second top gate. The second gate was identical to the first, its oak balance beam stretching out into the darkness, its iron strap hinges black against the pale stone, and the mitre post, which had been pressed against its partner's post in the watertight seal for the duration of the fill, now stood slightly ajar because the opening of the first gate had relieved the pressure on the joint, leaving a gap of perhaps an inch through which water was seeping with a soft, contented gurgle, as if the lock were sighing in its sleep. Thomas walked to the balance beam, placed his hands on the worn top surface, and felt the wood, which was cooler than the air because it had been facing away from the last of the sun. The grain slightly rougher on this side because fewer hands had touched it, though it was still polished to a dull sheen in the places where the lock-keeper's own shoulders and palms had worked it over the years. He set his left shoulder against the beam this time, because the beam on the offside required him to push from the opposite direction, and he found the hollow shallower here, because he used this side less often, but still familiar, still shaped by his own body through uncountable repetitions. He planted his feet, drew a breath, and began to lean, and the second gate, already eased by the parting of the mitre joint, started to move more readily than the first had done, its pintle turning in the stone socket with a sound that was softer, more a rumble than a grind, the water in the lock chamber parting before the moving face of the gate with a quiet, lipping murmur. The gap between the two mitre posts widened smoothly, the water that had been seeping now flowing freely in a broad black ribbon that poured into the lock with a deep, restful noise, and the gate leaf swung in a steady arc, its balance beam moving across the offside coping until it too came to rest against the stone wing wall with a gentle, final thud. Now the entrance to the lock from the upper pound was fully open, a wide stone-lined mouth that gaped into the darkness of the canal beyond, and the top gates, folded back against the lock walls on both sides, framed the approach channel like two welcoming arms. The narrowboat Mildred, still waiting on the other side, was now directly visible through the opening, its bow a dark, rounded shape that nosed towards the sill, its cabin lamp a warm, steady glow that was no longer partly hidden by the gate, but shone clear and full across the water, and the steerer, standing at the tiller on the stern deck, lifted his hand in a small, easy gesture that was both a greeting and an acknowledgement, a silent word of thanks that needed no reply. The horse, still held lightly by the steerer's wife, pricked its ears at the sight of the open gate and shifted its weight, its hooves making a soft muffled beat on the tow line which had been slack, drew taut again as the animal leaned ever so slightly into the collar, ready to start the boat forward. Thomas stood on the offside coping beside the open gate, his hands at his sides, his windlass hanging at his belt, and he looked through the wide mouth of the lock at the dark water of the upper pound, stretching away between the hedgerows, a lane of reflected starlight that led the eye towards the distant bend. The surface of the pound was as still as the water in the chamber, the two bodies now one continuous sheet, and the silence of the night, which had been filled with the sounds of winding and rushing and creaking, returned slowly. The cricket resuming its chirp from the hedge, the bats flickering once more across the face of the stars. The lock was open, the boat was waiting, and the long, slow passage of Mildred from the upper pound into the lock chamber was the only movement that remained. A movement that would begin in its own time, when the horse leaned forward and the steerer gave the smallest pressure on the tiller, and the narrowboat slid through the stone mouth into the quiet waiting water beyond. With the top gates folded back against the stone walls, and the lock chamber lying open to the upper pound like a dark still pool, the moment had arrived for the narrowboat Mildred to begin its slow passage through the stone throat and into the waiting water. Thomas stood on the offside coping, his windlass hanging quietly at his belt, his hands resting one over the other at the small of his back, and he watched without any need to signal or call out, because the steerer and his wife understood the rhythm as well as he did, their movements unfolding in a sequence that required no words, only the quiet, mutual awareness of people long accustomed to the canal. The horse, a chestnut with a white blaze and a pale sock on its left hind leg, had been standing with its head lowered while the gates were opened, but now it lifted its muzzle and looked towards the open lock mouth with a calm, attentive expression, its large, dark eyes reflecting the faint glow of the cabin lamp. And when the steerer's wife gave the smallest pressure on the bridle and made a soft clicking sound with her tongue, the animal leaned its weight forward into the padded leather collar, the harness creaking once. The towline, which had been slack and dipping into the water between the horse and the boat, drew taut with a gentle, gradual tension, the hemp fibers stretching by the smallest fraction as they took up the load, and the narrowboat Mildred, 70 feet of painted wood and quiet purpose, stirred from its stillness with a movement so slight it might have been mistaken for a breath of wind, had there been any wind. The bow, which had been nosing towards the top gate sill, began to glide forward over the dark water, the reflection of the painted roses and the white scrollwork sliding across the surface like a ghost of itself, and the steerer, standing at the tiller on the stern deck, made a tiny adjustment of the brass bar, moving it no more than an inch to starboard, so that the boat's heading aligned perfectly with the center of the lock opening. He did not call out or raise his voice. The only sound from him was the soft, rhythmic creak of the tiller swivel as the boat answered the correction, and the faint, dry rasp of his boot soles on the deck, planking as he shifted his weight. The boat entered the lock with a slowness that fell somewhere between walking and floating, the bow crossing the stone sill where the thin sheet of water from the gate paddle still trickled. And as the hull slipped into the chamber, the narrow clearance on either side became immediately apparent, the width of the lock being no more than 7 feet and the beam of the narrowboat a shade under that, so that the gap between the hull and the stone walls was measured in inches, the thickness of a spread hand. The fenders, thick loops of old rope that hung over the side at regular intervals, made the first contact with the stone with a soft, muffled, cushioning sound. Not a scrape, but a gentle, fibrous kiss, and they compressed slightly under the boat's gentle momentum before rolling against the wall with a rhythm that matched the slow, steady pace of the horse. The steerer's wife had stepped from the bow onto the lock coping as the boat entered, moving with an easy, practiced stride, the boat hook in her hand used not to push or fend, but simply held ready, its brass tip catching the lamplight, and she walked alongside the boat as it advanced, her eyes traveling over the fenders and the gunwale and the line of the cabin roof, checking everything in a single sweeping glance that found nothing wrong. Inside the lock chamber, the water was so still that the boat's reflection preceded it, a dark inverted double that glided across the starry surface before the hull itself arrived, and when the bow passed over its own reflection, the image shattered into 1,000 wobbling fragments of light that slowly reassembled as the boat continued forward, the stars returning one by one to their places in the dark mirror behind the stern. The sound within the chamber was close and hushed, the soft wash of water displaced by the hull echoing off the stone walls with a whispery, intimate quality, and the lamplight from the cabin windows threw a warm amber glow onto the wet stones as the boat moved deeper into the lock, illuminating patches of moss and the small dark ferns that grew from the mortar joints, their fronds trembling slightly in the gentle current of the boat's passage. The steerer, his attention divided between the bow and the towline and the horse that was now walking steadily along the towpath, gave the tiller another minute adjustment, and the boat straightened perfectly, its long painted flank passing within a finger's breadth of the stone, without touching, the fenders the only points of contact. As the stern cleared the top gate sill and the whole length of Mildred was inside the chamber, the steerer called out a single quiet word to his wife, who nodded and moved to the bollard where the mooring line was fastened. She lifted the eye off the iron post with a smooth, unhurried motion, coiled the line loosely on her forearm, and then walked forward along the coping to keep pace with the boat as it continued towards the far end of the lock, where the lower gate stood closed, their mitre edges pressed together and their balance beams stretching out like dark arms in the lamplight. The horse, feeling no resistance from the towline now that the boat was inside the lock, stopped of its own accord and stood on the towpath with its head turned slightly, watching the boat with the same patient, liquid gaze it had given everything else that evening. Thomas, who had remained on the offside coping while the boat entered, now walked around the head of the lock and crossed to the towpath side, his boots making a soft, regular sound on the flagstones, and he went to the top gate balance beam, the one he had pushed open only minutes before. He set his shoulder against the worn hollow in the oak, planted his feet, and began to push in the opposite direction, closing the gate with the same slow, steady pressure he had used to open it. The gate leaf swung back across the water, its pintle turning in the stone socket with a deep grinding note that was quieter than the opening had been, because the movement was downhill now, the gate's own weight helping to carry it home, and the water, displaced by the closing face of the gate, flowed gently out of the narrowing gap with a soft, lipping gurgle. The mitre post met its partner's post with a solid wooden thump that echoed once in the lock chamber and then was quiet, and the gate paddles, which had been left open, still trickled their thin silver sheets into the water, though Thomas would close them in a moment as part of the next sequence. He repeated the closing on the offside gate, crossing the walkway plank for what felt like the dozenth time that evening, and pushed the second lever shut until it, too, rested firmly against its partner, the joint watertight and true. The boat now lay enclosed in the lock chamber, its bow near the top gates and its stern near the bottom, the water level still exactly matching the upper pound, and the steerer, having seen the gates close behind him, walked forward along the gunwale to the bow, where he took the mooring line from his wife and dropped its eye over a bollard set into the coping near the lower gates, securing the boat in preparation for the draining. His wife, her part in the entry complete, returned to the horse and stood by its head, her hand resting lightly on the warm, smooth skin of its neck, and together they waited while Thomas began the next part of the ritual, the opening of the lower ground paddles that would drain the water from the lock and lower the boat down to the level of the lower pound. Thomas walked to the bottom end of the lock, where the lower ground paddle gear stood on the towpath side, a black iron frame identical to the ones at the top, its spindle waiting and its ratchet pawl engaged. He took his windlass from his belt, fitted it onto the spindle, and began to wind, turning the handle in the same steady, unhurried rhythm he had used at the top, the ratchet clicking its paired notes as the paddle rose from its seat deep underwater. The sound that followed was the inverse of the filling, a deep hollow roar as water from the lock chamber began to flow out through the culvert and into the lower pound, the level inside the chamber starting to drop with a slowness that was at first almost imperceptible, the wet line on the stone walls creeping downward by fractions of an inch. The narrowboat Mildred, still secured by its bowline, began to sink with the water, its painted gunwale descending past the stone coping, and the fenders, which had been kissing the walls near the top, began to roll slowly downward, their rope fibers squeaking very faintly against the stone as the hull settled lower and lower. The steerer stood on the stern deck, one hand on the tiller and the other holding a second line that he had passed around a bollard astern, paying it out inch by inch as the boat descended, keeping the vessel centered in the chamber with the same calm automatic precision he had used for the entry. Thomas opened the second lower ground paddle on the offside, walking around the foot of the lock and repeating the winding in the darkness, the sound of the draining water now a deep, continuous chord that filled the cutting and echoed off the stone, and he stood by the paddle gear while the water level dropped past the halfway mark, the stone walls rising wet and gleaming above the boat, the smell of cold deep water and stirred silt rising from the chamber in a damp, earthy cloud. The boat descended with a smooth, even motion, the towline slackening as the horse stood still on the towpath, and when the water inside the lock had fallen to exactly the level of the lower pound, a state that Thomas recognized by the sudden softening of the culvert roar as the two levels equalized, he lifted the windlass from the spindle and let the paddle pawls lock into place, the draining complete. Now the lower gates, which had been held shut by the greater height of water inside the lock, were free to open, and Thomas went to the towpath side balance beam and set his shoulder against it, pushing with the same slow, heavy pressure, the pintle grinding in its socket, the mitre joint parting with a wet, sucking sigh, and the gate leaf swung open over the dark water of the lower pound. He opened the second gate from the offside, crossing the lower walkway plank while the steerer and his wife made ready to depart, and when both lower gates were folded back against the wing walls, the narrowboat Mildred lay at the threshold of the lower reach, its bow already beginning to nose into the open water beyond the sill. The steerer released the stern line and walked forward to the bow, where he lifted the mooring eye from the bollard and handed it to his wife on the towpath, who took it with a quiet, practiced movement and held it loosely while the horse, responding to another soft click of her tongue, leaned into the collar and began to walk once more. The tow-line tightened. The boat stirred, and Mildred glided out of the lock chamber with the same hushed, deliberate motion with which it had entered, its bow crossing the lower sill and emerging into the wide, dark surface of the lower pound, where the water stretched away between the alders towards a bend that was already lost in the night. The steerer stood at the tiller, his pipe still unlit, his eyes on the dark shape of the towpath ahead, and as the boat cleared the lock, he lifted his hand from the brass bar and raised it in a silent, open-palmed gesture of thanks, a salute that Thomas acknowledged with his usual slow nod, a movement so slight it was little more than a downward tilt of the chin. The horse walked on, its hooves making a steady, rhythmic clopping on the packed earth, its feathery fetlocks catching the starlight in pale, dusty puffs, and the narrowboat Mildred, its cabin lamp a diminishing square of warm amber, its painted roses fading to smudges of colour, slipped away along the lower pound with the soft, continuous hiss of its bow, parting the lower the Lown with the soft, continuous hiss of its bow, parting the still water. Thomas watched it go from his place beside the open-bottom gate, his hands resting on the cool iron of the windlass at his belt, and he followed the boat with his eyes until it had rounded the distant bend, the lamplight shrinking to a single tiny point of gold before it vanished entirely behind the dark mass of the alders. And then there was only the quiet water, the starry sky, and the deep, restful silence of the empty lock, waiting for its next slow passage through the summer night. The narrowboat Mildred had become a memory on the water, its cabin lamps dimmed first to a point of gold and then to nothing at all as it rounded the bend beyond the alders, and the sound of the horse's hooves on the towpath had faded by degrees into the general quiet of the night, until Thomas could no longer separate it from the soft, ambient murmur of the canal, the rustle of leaves, the distant trickle of the bywash. He stood beside the open lower gate, his left hand resting on the end grain of the balance beam, and let the silence return around him, without hurry, the way a pond settles after a stone has been dropped into it. The lock was empty now, drained to the level of the lower pound, its stone walls dark and wet and glistening faintly in the starlight, and the open gates both upper and lower framed a long, empty stone chamber that had done its work for the evening and was ready to be closed. The night air had cooled further, though it was still mild, carrying the scent of water and wet stone and the faint green tang of the meadowsweet on the offside, and the sky overhead was now fully dark, the Milky Way a broad, dusty river of light that spanned the heavens from horizon to horizon without a cloud to obscure it. Thomas removed his hand from the balance beam and took a single, unhurried breath, the kind of breath that marks the transition from one task to another, and then he turned towards the lower gates. The first of his closing duties was to shut the gate on the towpath side, the one whose beam he had pushed open only a short while before to let Mildred depart, and he walked the few paces to it now, his boots making a soft, gritty sound on the flagstones that had been worn smooth by his own feet over 20 years. The balance beam was cool under his palm, the oak dense and slightly damp from the night air, and he paused for a moment with his hand resting on the worn hollow where his shoulder had pushed, feeling the familiar grain and the faint oily sheen that years of hands had polished into the surface. He set his shoulder against the beam, found the hollow that fit him, planted his left foot a little forward on the stone, and began to lean, not with any force, but with a slow, steady pressure that came from his legs and his back, the same patient movement he had made thousands of times. The gate responded with a low, grinding note as the pintle turned in its stone socket, a sound that was deeper and more resonant than the opening had been, because the gate was moving through still water now, its weight pressing against the liquid as it swung, and the mitre post, which had been standing apart from its partner, began to close the gap with a wet, sucking whisper. Water, trapped in the narrowing space between the two gate leaves, squeezed out in a thin, silver trickle that splashed down into the lower pound with a soft, continuous patter, and the sound of the pintle grinding mixed with the splash and the creak of the iron straps to form a single, complex noise that filled the lock cutting for a long minute before resolving into a quiet, solid thud as the mitre edges met and the gate shilled shut. Thomas stood back, letting his shoulder drop, and he placed his palm flat against the face of the gate for a moment, feeling the vibration of the closure die away into stillness, the timber now silent and motionless, the joint watertight. He crossed to the offside lower gate by walking around the foot of the lock, his path taking him past the lower ground paddle gear, where the iron frame stood black and silent, its ratchet pawl engaged and the paddle fully down, the culvert now quiet after the draining. The second balance beam was cooler than the first, having been in shadow all evening, and when he set his shoulder against it, the wood felt slightly rougher under his jacket, the hollow shallower, but the motion was the same, a slow, deliberate push that sent the gate swinging through its arc with a deep grinding note and a wet, parting sigh from the mitre joint. The two leaves met with a gentle wooden bump, the sound muffled by the water that still wept from the joint in a thin, final trickle, and then the lower gates were closed, their balance beams stretching out over the dark water of the Pound in perfect symmetry, their iron strap hinges glinting weakly in the starlight. With the bottom end of the lock secure, Thomas turned and walked back along the towpath, coping towards the upper end. Passing the empty chamber on his left, its stone walls rising from the water in dark, wet plains, and the closed top gates ahead of him, their mitre posts pressed together in a seal that he would check in a moment. The walk was slow and easy, his windlass swinging gently against his thigh with each step, and he allowed his eyes to drift over the familiar shapes of the lock, the paddle gear standing at intervals like quiet sentinels, the walkway planks that spanned the chamber, the small ferns and mosses that clung to the mortar joints, and the still, black water that lay at the bottom, reflecting a scattering of stars that were the exact mirror of those overhead. A single water beetle was skating across the surface in the center of the chamber, its legs dimpling the water with tiny silver rings that expanded and vanished, and Thomas paused to watch it for a moment without thought, his breath slow and even, his body at rest in the middle of his work. When he reached the top gates, he first checked the mitre joint by running his hand down the line where the two gate leaves met, feeling the slight, cool wetness of the seal and the smooth, even pressure of the timbers against each other. The joint was sound as he knew it would be, and he moved next to the gate paddles, which he had left open after the filling, their thin silver sheets still spilling into the lock chamber in a gentle, continuous murmur. He took his windlass from his belt once more, the iron cool and familiar in his grip, and fitted the socket over the spindle of the towpath side gate paddle, winding it down with a steady, even turning that produced the soft, rapid ticking of the ratchet teeth, a sound like a small clock being wound in reverse. The paddle descended in its iron guides, the wooden plate sliding lower and lower until it seated firmly in its closed position, with a soft, solid thump that he felt through the windlass handle, and the flow of water into the lock stopped abruptly. The silver sheet vanishing, the murmur replaced by a sudden, ringing quiet. He walked around the head of the lock, crossing the walkway plank above the top gate with his boots finding the notched grooves by long habit, and he wound down the second gate paddle on the off side with the same careful, unhurried turning, watching the paddle sink into its slot until the last trickle of water ceased and the lock chamber lay entirely still, its surface flat and dark and entirely without motion. He lifted the windlass from the spindle, let the paw lock into place with a small click, and then he stood for a moment on the offside coping, looking across the lock at the dark hedgerows and the silhouette of his cottage chimney, which had stopped smoking now, the fire inside banked to a handful of glowing embers. The next part of the closing routine was the top gates themselves. Thomas descended the single stone step onto the offside wing wall and placed his hands on the balance beam of the offside top gate, setting his shoulder against the wood in the hollow that was less worn, and he pushed slowly, the gate swinging shut over the water with a deep grinding note that echoed once off the stone and then faded. The mitre posts met with a soft wooden thump, and the water, caught between them, wept for a second in a thin silver line before the joint sealed tight and the dripping stopped. He went around to the towpath side by crossing the walkway plank above the now closed gate, his boots making a hollow, rhythmic sound on the oak, and he pushed the last gate shut with the same slow, measured pressure, feeling the pintle turn in its socket and the mitre post press home against its partner, the two leaves coming together with a gentle, final thud that seemed to settle something deep in the stone and the earth. The top gates were now closed, the lock chamber sealed at both ends, and Thomas stood on the towpath coping with his hands resting on his hips, taking a long, slow look down the length of the lock to satisfy himself that all was as it should be. The chamber was a dark, rectangular pool held between the closed gates, its water perfectly still, reflecting the starry sky in a mirror so clear that it was difficult to believe there was stone and water at all, rather than a straight passage into another night. The ferns on the walls were wet and drooping, the moss dark and soft, and the small white feather that had been floating inside the lock when the evening began was now resting against the lower gate, motionless, a tiny pale shape on the black surface. He now turned his attention to the ground paddles. The first one, on the towpath side near the top gate, was still open by the small amount he had left it at the end of the fill, and he walked to it, fitted his windlass, and began to wind it down, the ratchet turning in reverse with its familiar paired clicks, the pawl lifting and falling, and the paddle deep underground descended through its slot, the culvert flow diminishing with each turn until the last of the water drained from the underground channel and the sound of rushing fell away into a hollow, distant silence. He repeated the winding on the offside top ground paddle, walking around the head once more to reach it, and then he did the same for the two lower ground paddles that he had left open after draining the lock, winding them down one after the other, the windlass moving in its steady rhythmic arcs, his arm working with a smooth, practiced economy that never varied, each paddle seated in its closed position with the same soft, definite thud, and the culverts beneath the lock fell silent one by one, the deep hidden waterways that had sung so loudly all through the filling and draining, now quiet, dark and still. When all four ground paddles were fully down, Thomas made a final circuit of the lock, walking slowly from the bottom gates to the top and back again, checking each ratchet pawl to be sure it was firmly engaged, running his fingers over the spindles to confirm they were tight, giving each balance beam a gentle, testing push with one hand to feel the solid resistance of the closed gates. He found nothing out of place, not a single loose bolt or a weeping joint or a misaligned spindle, and so he completed the circuit at his old starting point, the warm flagstone beside the lower gates where he had stood at the very beginning of the evening, before the horse had been heard and the water had been heard and the narrowboat had come and gone. The coiled rope was still there, lying in its neat loops with the spliced end on top, and he bent to pick it up, turning it over once to check for dampness or fraying, and then replaced it exactly as it had been, the loops aligned, the splice uppermost. The lock was now shut down, every paddle lowered, every gate closed, every mechanism at rest, and the silence that settled over the cutting was deeper and fuller than the silence that had preceded the boat, because the lock itself seemed to be sleeping, its voice stilled, its stones cooling in the night air. Thomas pulled the oily rag from his jacket pocket and wiped the windlass one final time, passing the cloth over the socket and the handle and the shaft in long, even strokes, and then he hooked the windlass back onto the leather loop at his belt and folded the rag into its neat square, tucking it away. He stood for a moment on the flagstone, his hands loose at his sides, and he looked up at the sky, which was now deep and black and brilliant with stars, the Milky Way, a broad, dusty path that seemed to follow the course of the canal, and he noted, without any particular thought, that the plough had swung around by a handspan since the evening began, marking the slow, silent passage of the hours. The air was cool enough now that he could see his own breath as a faint, pale ghost when he exhaled, and the grass on the towpath was beginning to gather the first whisper of dew, each blade ticked with a tiny, invisible drop that would be a silver bead by morning. A late moth, pale and silent, fluttered past his face and vanished into the darkness, and from the alder wood the owl that had called earlier gave a single soft hoot, the note hanging in the air for a long moment before dissolving. The cottage, when he turned towards it, was a dark shape against the slightly lighter sky, its chimney still and its door still half open as he had left it, and the square of the window held no light, only the faint reflection of a single star. Thomas walked back along the worn earth path that led from the lock to his doorstep, the same path he had walked earlier in the evening, but now the grass on either side was damp and brushed his trouser legs with a soft, wet whisper, and the clump of nettles by the corner of the cottage gave off a cool green scent as he passed. The iron latch on the door was cold under his fingers, the metal now chilled by the night, and when he pressed the thumb piece and the door swung inward on its well-greased, silent hinges, the air inside the cottage was warm and still, carrying the faint, pleasant smell of banked coal and dried herbs and the old, scrubbed wood of the table. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him with a gentle click of the latch, and stood for a moment in the dark, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper darkness within, where the only light was the very faint red glow of the fire showing through the grate bars. He did not light a lamp, for he needed no light to find his way around a room he knew as well as the shape of his own hands. He hung his cap on the peg beside the door, shrugged off his jacket and hung it beside the cap, and then sat down on the wooden chair by the table. The same chair he had risen from at the beginning of the evening, what felt like a very long time ago. He unlaced his boots slowly, pulling the laces with fingers that were stiff and cool, and set the boots beside the door, where they would wait for the morning. The tin clock on the mantelpiece ticked on, its sound a quiet, steady heartbeat in the dark room, and Thomas sat for a while with his hands resting on his knees, not thinking of anything in particular, his mind as still and quiet as the lock outside. After a time, he rose and climbed the steep ladder to the sleeping loft, where a narrow bed with a feather mattress and a wall blanket waited under the sloping roof. He lay down without undressing further, his body settling into the familiar hollows of the mattress with a long, slow sigh, and through the small skylight above his head he could see a patch of sky with 3 bright stars arranged in a small, neat triangle. Stars he had watched on countless nights from this exact position. The silence of the cottage was complete, broken only by the tick of the clock below and the very distant, almost imagined sound of a fox calling from somewhere far across the fields, a thin, sharp cry that rose and fell and then was gone. The lock, outside in the darkness, lay closed and still, its gate sealed, its paddles down, its water a perfect, motionless mirror for the stars. The wet stone cooled slowly in the night air, the ferns and mosses dripping their last drops into the chamber, the white feather resting against the lower gate without moving, and along the towpath the grass was already bending under the weight of the gathering dew. In the cottage, the fire in the range settled with a soft, crumbling sigh, the last of the embers shifting into ash, and the tin clock ticked on, marking the quiet hours of the summer night. The Oxford Canal, winding through the dark fields between Knapton and Banbury, held its level without effort, and the lock-keeper, his work done, slept without dreaming, as still and patient as the water he tended.